On the 4th day of the 6th month of the 9824th year after the founding of the Imperium, I sit here writing this. I am the renowned sorcerer, Tracurius. I know not my parents, for I was abandoned at birth. I do, however, possess knowledge of one thing, and that thing is that I'm about to embark on an impossibly dangerous, most ludicrous, and nigh impossible mission. It has been a year since the opening of the portal, the changing of the fates of thousands, if not millions. The mythical humans, who were so magically deficient that the greatest of them couldn't perform even the most basic of spells, had come out of this massive portal. Some say they were a curse to the world of Narivor, others say they were a blessing. Whatever you consider them to be, you can't deny their sheer power. They have conquered worlds we can't even begin to imagine. They have magicless magic which is capable of performing feats our greatest sorcerers can't even dream of, and they have conquered the fortress of Halamund and established themselves a permanent, strong political entity. The stalwart fortress city of Halamund held back dozens of the Ammonic incursions, and was renowned for its blood, steel, and warriors. During the dark of night, the humans conquered it within 3 bloody hours. All 3,500 soldiers permanently garrisoned were taken by surprise, as strange contraptions flew balls hotter than fire at them, going through their armor like a knife through hot butter. Of course, the attack on Halamund had a reason. The dwarves had killed the human emissaries when they arrived at Halamund, believing them to be Emini in disguise. This prompted the human attack of the Stoic fortress, which saw the dwarves humiliated and the humans elevated onto the political stage. Despite their grand accomplishments, they are still distrusted by the majority of the nobility, and the superstitious peasantry see them as naught but evil demons. However, there is one people with a particular interest in them which goes further than just leeching off their magicless magic, or trying to drag them into one of their petty political squabbles. These are the Amini, the dark folk of the cold north. Any sane, holy creature with common sense would reject these abominations outright. However, humans are neither sane nor holy, and they certainly don't have common sense. As such, they decided to negotiate with these unholy creatures. Not the ratmen, minotaurs, orcs, dwarves, and even the clinically insane beast folk haven't tried to do such a ridiculous and frankly idiotic thing. Then again, no other race has tried to build a speech ship and try to sail the realm of Astraleek. And so here I am, on my way to Gruntharn, a Ammonic fortress, on my way to prostrate myself to the humans and beg them to quit this foolish endeavor. My liege has already arranged for me to meet a particularly wealthy and influential human called Patricia of House Williams. Besides being rather wealthy, she's also the leading diplomat of the ludicrous make-friends with literal baby-eating monsters operation the humans are conducting. May Fortunus bless me lest the unholy abominations break my will. Tracurius smiled. He had made it. After a 2-month-long journey, he was at Gruntharn, home of the sinister Trisgar clan of Amini, and a host of human diplomats and their servants. He looked around him. For a Aeomonic castle, it was awfully peaceful. Around the castle, he saw fields and farms. The sun shone today, and the small lake about 5 kilometers from the castle was glistening. The castle itself was an impressive display of might. It had a sinister and dark aura emanating from it. Its architecture was very utilitarian, hard, and rough. It was in stark contrast to the architecture of most imperial castles, who, while being made for war, were also a display of elegance and art. But this building was brutish and harsh, like the people who inhabited it. Flanking Tracurius were 2 of the most valiant knights, Tiravir and Alanius. Both of them were known for their ability to spit in the face of death, having survived several things they really shouldn't have. Behind them, there was an entire entourage of cooks, cleaners, and other menial staff. There were also several translators and scribes to document whatever we were about to witness here. They were also accompanied by the 5th Imperial Regiment, a group of men-at-arms who were renowned for their use of pikes. Tracurius nodded at his entourage. "Come on now, let's not keep our hosts waiting," he said. As he took a step forwards, he felt the anxiety in the room. It was understandable. What they were about to do was idiotic. However, they had to press onwards, and as such Tracurius went forth at the very tip of the group. He hoped it would embolden others to follow his example. It worked, mostly. When they reached the gates, they were met with sight of two soldiers. Both of them had those strange contraptions the humans were known for. They were in gray metallic armor. However, this wasn't regular plate armor. It wasn't magical either. It was something different. Both of them had a strange sort of visor. It was completely black, and yet he could feel their eyes looking at him. One of them said something, however Tricurius couldn't understand them. For a few seconds they were talking in that language of theirs. It sounded like someone took Elvish and forcibly added a dialect of Dwarven, and then decided to mix it with words he couldn't even grasp the concept of. Then they spoke in his tongue, Elvish. It sounded flawless, without an accent, perfected through years of study. However, these humans had only known the existence of Elvish for a year at most. It also sounded processed, like a golem was talking, and not a man. "You are the elven emissaries, yes?" one of the soldiers asked. It wasn't like a golem was speaking. This had to be a golem. Elven is considered one of the most difficult languages to learn, and these humans managed to speak it flawlessly within less than a year of study. Tricurius nodded. "Correct. I assume we are expected," he said as he smiled a diplomatic smile. The heavily armored soldier nodded. "Yes, you are." The man pointed to the other soldier. "Corporal Johnson here will be escorting you to the keep. There you will meet with Lieutenant Carlson, who will help you with your future endeavors." Corporal Johnson turned around and pressed some button on his wrist. Suddenly the gate opened. Tricurius looked up in awe as several tons of steel were lifted up without seeing anyone or anything which was actually doing it. The corporal waved his hand indicating they should follow. They did. They walked through the large metallic gate. Tricurius looked out into the castle. To the right was a small tavern, to the left of him was a smithery, and in the distance he saw a well and a large storage house. Houses were scattered all around the area, and he could see a market in front of the storage house. The corporal started walking. They followed. Eventually they reached a hill. On top was the keep. The architecture was as brutish on the inside as on the outside. Outside of the keep he saw several strange iron blocks, mounted on what he could only assume were wheels made out of a strange black material. Around it were some strange creatures. "These must be the humans," Tricurius said under his breath. They were as tall, if not taller, than most elves, and yet they were nearly as broad as a dwarf. They wore green uniforms. With black boots he looked at one of their faces. The soldier had some strange metal etched into his eye. It looked horrifying. Perhaps it was a punishment. After all, no holy creature would defile their body like that. The corporal halted and turned around to face the elves. "Wait here. I shall return quickly," he said, as the corporal sprinted towards the entrance of the keep. Tricurius was amazed at how quickly the corporal moved in that full set of armor. Perhaps some kind of magic made it lighter. But the humans didn't have magic. There had to be some logical explanation for this. Did the Emini curse the humans with magic? But the Emini couldn't curse, nor could they bless. They didn't have gods, considering the holy ones to be foul tricksters who should be treated with apathy. A few minutes later and the soldier returned. A shorter human was accompanying him, as well as a particularly hairy dwarf and a rather tall Emini. The human stepped forward and extended his hand. Like most other races, the human had 5 fingers. Tricurius didn't know what he was supposed to, so he decided to be as courteous as he could be. He bowed deeply and started speaking. "Greetings, sir. I assume you are Lieutenant Carlson?" he asked. The human smiled and retracted his hand and hastily made some attempt at a low bow. "You would be correct in that assumption." The human paused for a moment. "So, who do I have the pleasure of meeting?" he asked. Tricurius wondered what to do for a moment. "I am the High Emissary, Tricurius. I was told you would get us to our quarters for tonight." Carlson nodded. "I will, but first you need to know a few things." Carlson spoke. "First of all, none of this is magic. Don't try and use magic on it. It usually results in fires, death, or a combination of the two," he said in a stern voice, like a father explaining to his son the rules of the house. "Second off," the Emini handed the human several sheets of paper. "Read this and sign it." Carlson handed Tracurius the sheet of paper. Tracurius eagerly inspected it. It was in Elven. It was also grammatically correct. It was rare for the lesser races to actually know how to speak Elven, let alone write it. But the humans had outdone themselves when they didn't just write it. They wrote it well. It took a moment for Tracurius to read the whole thing. The beginning section was outlining the punishments for any transgression, the second about the rules themselves, and the third about the fact that any transgression of Elven law wasn't going to be punished by humanity. After he was finished reading, the human gave him a strange instrument which seemed to have infinite ink, as he didn't need to dip it into any for it to work. He signed the contract. When he was done signing, he was surprised to hear that anyone in his service had to read and sign it as well. That was going to be a bit of a problem since not everyone could read, let alone write. So they agreed to read the rules out loud to everyone in his service, and they would give their verbal consent to the rules. After it was over, Carlson ordered them to follow him. Tracurius followed Carlson with both enthusiasm and a tinge of anxiety. When he entered the keep, he noticed several things. First of all, there were no torches, yet the entire hallway was illuminated. There were metallic constructs attached to the ceiling which were somehow projecting light. Despite there not being any Ternitia being the general name for all types of magic and energy, floating about he could sense thunder. Perhaps runes? No, that couldn't be. Runes stored Ternitia, and there weren't any thunder mages around either. Perhaps they trapped lightning. However, lightning wasn't a very common thing. They simply wouldn't have enough for it. Tracurius set aside the thought for a moment and continued following Carlson. The walls were almost stainless white. He couldn't see the stone underneath it. Who would spend so much time and effort on making their walls a pretty shade of white? Tracurius wondered. When they finally arrived at their quarters, his courtiers were all put into separate rooms. How many rooms did they construct? Tracurius wondered. Tracurius himself was escorted into an especially luxurious room. Carlson spoke. "See this switch here?" He pointed at it and flicked it. The lights were suddenly dimmed, then flicked it again, and the room was illuminated. "It controls the lights." Tracurius was in awe. Not only did they have thunder without magic, they also controlled it. It was awe-inducing, really. The sheer wealth of technology, science, and new techniques they could pick up from these humans was incredible. However, sadly, he wasn't on a technological exchange mission. He was here to prevent a third Eomonic War. The first Eomonic War took place in 3563 after the founding of the Imperium. Thousands, if not more, died. It was only due to the intervention of the incredibly zealous dwarves that ensured the Imperium would not collapse. The Second War was even worse, causing the dwarves to shatter into several clay clans united under a high king, however still very much divided in different factions. The first of these factions were the Voron. They considered it their duty to conserve the ancient ways. The ancient ways included honoring Astraliac above others. After all, he created the universe, and he was as supremely powerful as he was fickle. He bound the gods to the world, and then ensured they would not destroy it, as parts of the gods were spread around the world creating the various races. Their calendar is a countdown to the rebirth of nations, which would see both the gods and the world devoured by Astraliac and reabsorbed into the infinite void that is the universe. The second were the Leoans. They shunned Astraliac instead of honoring him, and followed the pantheon of the three divine ones. Guerin, god of war and the bow, Hartarn, god of victory, pain and smiths, and last Trinestarn, god of death and the afterlife. A third Eomonic invasion could spell doom for the remaining dwarven clans, the end of the Imperium, and perhaps even the annihilation of the beast races. The sheer power the humans held could not fall into the hands of the Amoni, lest they use it to shatter and destroy the world as we know it. Tracurius was forcibly pulled out of his thoughts when Carlson started speaking. "Right, so this is a shower," he pointed at it, "and that is a toilet." He pointed at the second thing. He stepped into the sewer. He gripped an iron mechanism. Pulling it up towards the red side makes the water warmer. Pulling it down towards the blue side makes it colder. He then gripped another metal mechanism. Pulling this up will increase the water flow. He pulled it up, and suddenly water came flooding out from it. and pulling it down will decrease it. Was there an element they couldn't control? Tricurius wondered. These humans didn't just have incredibly powerful weaponry. They could probably at least provide water for an entire army with these shewers. No need for you know how it works just yet. Just don't try to use magic on it, please. Carlson said the last part in a tired and, quite frankly, desperate tone. It was like someone had already tried to do that, and it ended in a disaster. Not all that unlikely, Tricurius reasoned. I understand. Do I need to know anything else? Tricurius asked the human. The human shook his head. No, this will be it for today. You can get food at the cafeteria. We've got cooks working there from 6 in the morning to 9 in the evening. The human said. He turned around and started walking towards the exit. And have a good evening, the human said on his way out. Tricurius simply stood there for a few moments in awe of everything he had just seen. He knew the humans were supposed to be advanced, but they were leagues ahead of the most well-developed nation on the world, Narevor, the Elven Imperium. Unless you counted the Aemonic settlements who had invented and popularized the widespread use of gunpowder 30 years prior to this very moment. Then again, gunpowder alone was far weaker than sorcery. He decided to meet up with his 2 knights and eat something. He hadn't eaten for an entire day at this point, so he was quite hungry. To his surprise, the 2 knights were already waiting outside. Sir, what is our plan of action? Trivir, one of the knights, asked. I'll probably go and eat something at this cafeteria, the human mentioned. He said it would serve food to us. Tricurius said. The knights looked at him and nodded, forming a wedge formation around him. He followed the directions some humans he encountered gave him to the cafeteria until he eventually arrived there. It was a large, spacious room, with those same white metallic torches on the ceiling. There were 3 windows looking over the courtyard, where there were more of those iron constructions on black wheels as well as more humans. The sun was already setting. It must be evening. For a moment, he wondered how the humans would keep track of time. He reasoned they probably used some unreasonably advanced system to make sure the time was accurate to the second. Tricurius ordered something called a steak, which according to the human cook was very similar to Nerfrat's, which he always thoroughly enjoyed. The human was not lying when he said it was similar to Nerfrat's. He got the same sensations and the same taste of well-cooked Nerfrat's as he got with this steak. The knights too ate something the human called chicken breast, alongside potatoes and some fresh water. Tricurius himself got to experience the joys of tea. According to the humans, it was funny that he enjoyed it. Something about Imperials always liking the tasteful beverage. Some of his entourage had joined in on the meal, and he got to discuss some potential diplomatic strategies with one of the historians he brought alongside him. He also discussed how humans utilized thunder with one of his sorcerers. He speculated they didn't use thunder. Instead, they just used energy which was contained in thunder. An interesting thought for sure. At the end of this useful dinner, he went to bed, as did most of his entourage. Perhaps he could meet the leading human diplomat tomorrow. Tricurius woke up early in the morning, for the sun had not yet risen. He expected the room he was in to be cold. He was wrong. After a bit of speculating and searching, he found the source of the warmth. It was a strange white metallic contraption attached to the wall. So the humans also controlled temperature, and it wouldn't surprise him if they also held some control over combustion magic. Sadly, he couldn't find the light switch the human had mentioned the evening prior. He concentrated for a moment and lighted a flame within the palm of his hand, channeling some of his stored-up ternitia into combusting, thus forming the small flame. He scoured around the room, finally finding the switch and diffusing his flame by stopping the ternitia inflow, and put on his robe. He suspected his servants weren't yet awake. It was more near midnight than it was near sunrise, after all. Besides being a diplomat, he was also an accomplished sorcerer and scholar. Educating himself was his responsibility, and so he decided to read a bit. Usually he'd read tomes about the several schools of magic, but he decided to change it up for once. He had always liked studying imperial history and decided to revisit the classics. First up was the Skalderium. It was a collection of different books written by an infamous dwarven scholar named Finar. It went over the basics, such as the founder of the Imperium, Nachtigall von Riemann, who was a champion of Wutharn and popularized not just the worship of the three gods, Wutharn, god of war and bloodshed, Sanruin, god of pleasure and logia, goddess of righteous rule and laws, but also that of the emperor of emperors and king of kings, Astrolaic. Furthermore, it also went over how von Riemann gained control over the Imperium, his humble beginnings as a warrior, and how he slew his village's chief, gaining control over the village. Then he asked for Wutharn's patronage, and swore on his honor that he would go into battle undaunted as would all his children, and spill blood in Wutharn's name. He honored this pledge, slaughtering his way through the world, conquering from the Silver Sea's shores to the riverbanks of the Ulark. So much blood had he spilled that Wutharn named him his peer in skill. By the mortal world he was declared a god, by the gods he was seen as their equal, and even his sworn enemies, the dwarves and Emini, named him the red-handed king, thus creating the imperial cult, who besides the previously named four gods, also venerates Riemann, whose domain is ambition, conquest, and kingship. However, Riemann wasn't just a mindless brute, he was also an adept administrator and governor. Within 10 years, his village went from a small settlement near a river to the capital of his newly founded imperium, Reimstadt. Reimstadt is still the capital of the imperium and the largest and most prosperous city in perhaps the entire world. It houses 2 million loyal subjects of the imperium and is the most populous city in all of the imperium. Riemann conquered elf, Emini, dwarf, orc, and beastmen. He instituted a universal amount of taxes and levies the various provinces had to pay to their dukes, who would in turn pay half of that to the emperor. After reading for a few hours, the sun had finally risen, and he decided to make use of the human's Schäufer. It was a most refreshing experience. It was like bathing, but standing. The water never got filthy, and he could just sense the purity of it. Following the refreshing experience, he turned the apparatus off and dried himself using a towel near the shower. If they can offer this sheer degree of hospitality to their guests, how prosperous would human cities be then? Perhaps even larger and richer than even Reimstadt itself. After he was done drying himself, he put on his colorful garments. He looked into the mirror and looked at himself for a moment. His deep purple eyes were very common amongst elves. He had hazel-brown hair, something which was rather rare amongst elves. Mirrors were incredibly expensive within the Imperium, and yet according to his servants, all their rooms had them. Maybe the material mirrors were made out of was more common in the human world than it was on Naravor. After he was finished inspecting himself, he stepped outside. It was noticeably colder outside, although still bearable. He did go back inside and pick up his cloak, however. He met up with his knights and went to the grand dining hall the humans called the cafeteria. Maybe this cafeteria was a great human legend or god. There he saw many of his servants already sitting down and eating. He was informed he would be having bacon, eggs, and bread. He also asked for some tea. He didn't know how he could have survived without it all these years. He was talking to a sorcerer about human combustion magic when a human came walking up to him. It was that same Carlson as yesterday. "Sir, the head diplomat will be able to attend to your quarry within 6 hours at 1300 to 1400, longer if necessary," the man said. Confused, Tracurius looked up at him. 1300 to 1400 hours? Is that how you measure time? Tracurius asked Carlson. The human face palmed and handed him a strange device. "That is a watch. It's currently 7:43. The human pointed at one of the clock hands pointing at the 7. The total amount of hours in a human day seemed to be 12 hours long. The second, longer clock hand pointed to 3/4 to the 8. "Interesting," he mumbled to himself. There was also another clock hand, which was constantly moving. It was tracking seconds, so the humans did measure time so accurately it was to the second. The material the watch was made out of confirmed his hypothesis that the humans were filthy rich. It was seemingly actual, pure glass. It was also decorated with gold and silver. It was a magnificent piece of engineering in and of itself, even without the grand decorations. After Tracurius was done marveling at the device, Carlson spoke. "Each day has 24 hours. Each hour has 60 minutes and each minute has 60 seconds. So, his hypothesis about days having 12 hours was false. You'll need to go to the large red-roofed palace just outside of the gardens when the little clock hand points at the one, Carlson said. He pointed to the outside, and in the distance, he could see a reasonably sized building with, indeed, a red roof. If you somehow don't know how to get there, ask anyone, Carlson said, after which he turned around and left. Tracurius put the watch around his wrist. Anyone from Naravor would think he was high royalty with such a magnificent and richly decorated device, which was so well engineered it could measure the time and move on its own without magic. The humans, however, probably thought of this as standard equipment. If they could afford to give one of their guests such a miraculous instrument, without demanding anything in return, then this must be some standard thing for them. After speaking with his servants about the humans' possible goals, eating his meal and asking around where the red-roofed palace was, he finally found it and was ready to begin. He was nervous. That was strange for him. He had been on countless diplomatic missions. Not only that, but he had settled countless conflicts peacefully and without bloodshed. Yet those were petty or lesser races. Petty races being those barely above animals, rat-men, man-bulls, and other such creatures all belonged to this order. Lesser races were those who weren't blessed with divine favor and the grace that only elves had, yet still were important political parties. Emini, dwarves, and orcs all belonged to this category. While yes, elves were numerically inferior, they were intellectually and magically superior. And yet he had the feeling these humans wouldn't be like the lesser or petty races. They moved with as much grace as the average elf, spoke the elven language fluently, or at least it seemed like that, and had a special sort of magic. Maybe they weren't blessed with divine favor, but their other attributes more than made up for this. Of course, he wasn't convinced these humans were superior to his glorious race. After all, the divine is above all, including their magicless magic. Whatever these humans were, he was both eager and nervous to meet them. He was still a scholar at heart, and the opportunity to learn things, be that from beasts, his lesser or his peers, was still exciting. And so he entered the room, his two knights closely following him. He saw one of those humans in a steel suit of armor move around the room. It was almost like the suit itself was moving, and the human was merely controlling it, albeit not moving it around. In his hands he carried that strange device he had learned the humans called a plasma gun. Apparently that was how they decimated Halamond within 3 hours. In the center of the room was a desk. A fierce light shined throughout the entire room due to one of those lamps. Against the white wall were several tables with books, papers, and those infinite ink devices on them. Behind the desk was what Tracurius assumed to be head human diplomat, Patricia of House Williams. Like Carlson, she had dark, nigh-black hair. However, unlike Carlson, she had blue eyes instead of green ones. Humans, Tracurius had noticed, usually had far more rugged faces than most elves. Both Carlson and Patricia were no exception, and yet they still had that remarkably graceful stride, for a non-elf, of course. The woman smiled and beckoned him in. "Greetings, Diplomat Tracurius," she said with a warm voice. "I assume everything has been to your liking?" she asked. Tracurius nodded politely. "Of course it has. I assume my presence hasn't been too much of strain on your resources," he asked. She nodded. "Not at all." She paused. "However, I am sure you haven't traveled from Reimstadt to here to exchange pleasantries," she said, looking at him more intensely. Tracurius put on an aloof expression and nodded. "Indeed I have not," he said. "I have come here to warn you of a threat most dire, one that will certainly spell doom lest you aid us in quelling it," he said. The armored soldier who was there from the beginning put off his helmet, revealing a heavily scarred face with one of those strange iron eyes. He whispered something in the human language to the leading diplomat. She whispered something back, however. Before she did so, she pressed a strange iron thing inside her ear. She then pressed the thing inside her ear again. "Please, go on," she said. The elf breathed in deeply. "The Aemoni, as you may know, have pillaged and raided their way across our steadfast and just imperium for centuries, if not millennia at this point. I urge you cull and purge them. They will do the same to you." He said, They're simply sharpening their dagger, ready to stab you in the back with it when they see their opportunity, and then twist it so that you might never recover. His voice was stern. He had his eyes fixed on her, speaking with absolute clarity. The diplomat merely chuckled. They raided and pillaged their way across your imperium after your founder slaughtered them like cattle. Then you retaliated. They in turn started raiding and pillaging as revenge, she said. She went from her laid-back position to sitting straight up. This created a vicious, nigh unbreakable cycle, she continued. One that without a more powerful third party simply is unbreakable. However, I intend to break it. Her voice went from a warm tone to one determined to do whatever it took to accomplish her goals. She stood up. Humanity is that incredibly powerful third party. We intend nothing but to ensure peace, prosperity, and prevent the annihilation of all, she said. Perhaps that was the only thing that we learnt from the destruction of Earth, she said somberly. Destruction of Earth? As in the material, the humans destroyed all of Earth. Tricurius let it sink in for a few moments. With no Earth, there would be no crops, no cattle grazing, and thus no food. How did they? Humans were an anathema. Tricurius didn't even need to think about it. However, were these humans really as powerful as they thought? They had the element of surprise at Halamond after all. Not just that, but they could prepare their attack. You suppose humanity is powerful enough to conquer all of the Imperium, let alone Naravor? He asked. It was a genuine question. These humans were powerful. Nobody doubted that anymore. But how powerful were they, actually? Patricia looked at him. Within 3 hours, we captured Halamond, with 30 soldiers, she said. We have mastered the sky, the sea, the land, and even space itself. We can destroy your entire world within the press of a button. We are choosing to give you the choice of peace. Pausing for a moment, she continued shortly afterwards. We choose to be better. Because we know what happens when you actually use those tools of mass destruction. We know the suffering and misery that kind of warfare will bring, she said firmly. She put her fist down. Billions, if not trillions, died for our planet. Even more died after that trying to find refuge amongst the stars, she said in a harsh tone. 98% of the entire population lay dead. And for what? For the glory of some government who saved themselves before their people? For the privilege of owning a wasteland, broken, molested, and uninhabitable due to unrelenting warfare? You came here with a request, and I shall send you back to your petty emperor with a request of my own. End your petty squabble. You're both wrong. It doesn't matter who started. It only matters who will end this ridiculous conflict of yours. Tricurius didn't know what to say. Of course, the Imperium was right. There was no debating that. Ryman conquered and civilized the Amoni. He didn't slaughter them. He improved their miserable standard of living. And what did he get for his forgiveness, his mercy? He got this. Ungrateful bastards. They dared involve these humans. These madmen could blow up entire worlds. They overpowered all of Naravor by a lot there. Maybe, just maybe, if they gathered every sorcerer in Naravor, sacrificed everyone for Ternitia, they might just be able to pull something like that off. However, to do such a thing with the press of a button, well, that's dangerous. What if that button falls into the hands of the wrong person? What then? The human sighed and nodded. Even though I disagree with your reasons on why, I do agree with your general idea. You shall be invited to next week's negotiations. The elf grinned victoriously, starting an argument with an elf. What a foolish decision. Besides being expert magicians, elves were known for their mental prowess, being able to out-hink any race. This, along with their divine heritage, also contributed to their magical prowess. I beg you don't do this. This highfalutin will surely sabotage the negotiations. You can't trust them with their evil trickery, the Imana yelled. The human shook her head. As I've already said, Ambassador Harasu of House Narasis, I see you as equals, and thus give you the exact same privileges and rights. Besides, we're not here to play favorites. We're here to establish a lasting peace. The ambassador, who was apparently called Harasu, was simply fuming. It wouldn't surprise Tricurius if he'd charged the human ambassador. However, she was still stoic. The guard to the right, however, had raised that contraption of his. The moment he did that, Harasu took a step back, and with a mean look on his face, walked out of the room. "Ambassador, you two are dismissed. I will have Carlson bring you the documents needed to attend the negotiations," she said politely. The elf nodded and turned around, a smug smile on his face. His knights followed him eagerly. Once they had exited the room, he discussed with his knights what he would do. He himself would most likely go to his quarters and wait for Carlson to deliver his documents, after which he would try to scour the entire castle for information about the humans, anything to turn the negotiations into his favor. There was a long road ahead of him. However he felt great, he did it. He ensured he would at least have some say in the upcoming negotiations. He ensured the Imperium and, by extension, civilization would have some say. Patricia sighed. Beside her, Jansen chuckled. "I think the Ammoni actually know what guns are and what they can do," he said. "You should have seen that ambassador's face when I raised my rifle," the Dutchman enthusiastically said. She raised an eyebrow. "I mean, they've invented gunpowder. The man even mentioned an arquebus," she said. A few seconds after she said that, Ambassador Shin entered her office. The Earthborn man had a brown complexion and black hair. He entered with enthusiasm. "So, how did our favorite elf react to his relentless hypocrisy and mind-bending logic being rejected?" he asked. He ranted on and on about how he and his precious Imperium was right because they learnt from their mistakes, even if they really didn't. She said, "I'm not sure why Command thought not immediately inviting the fools was a good idea. Now you have to write a report about them, and I will probably have to entertain them when they inevitably break something." Something about the Ammoni heckling us and the dwarves getting even more upset, as if the conflict with Halamund wasn't bad enough. Shin said, "I'm curious how the dwarves will discuss Halamund. They killed 3 ULE citizens." Patricia looked at Shin, probably calling it an attack which was totally warranted because we provoked them, or some other form of mental gymnastics, she stated. Shin nodded. "They're indoctrinated, you know, both the dwarves and elves. It's why Command didn't invite but instead let them come to us. They'd kill us if they realized we liked one over another." He paused before continuing. "Regardless, send me the transcript and recording, and I'll make something semi-coherent to send to Command." "Good plan. I'm going to entertain 2 dwarves who will also probably want to attend," she said before swiftly standing up. "But first, I'm getting some coffee. You want some too?" Shin shook his head. "Never understood how people can like that bitter, drap-brown beverage," he said. He frowned in disgust. Patricia let out a slight chuckle. "Right." She turned her head to Jansen. "Mail him the transcript and recording of the meeting, and let us prepare for the dwarves," she said. Jansen nodded and used his suit to transfer the recording and the transcript to Shin's computer in the next room. Shin walked away while waving his hand. Patricia turned her phone for a moment. 14:04. In 56 minutes, the dwarves would come. She had a small briefing concerning them. They were divided into a traditionalist and a more progressive faction, the Voron and the Leoans. The Voron could best be described as doomsday cultists, counting down to the end of the world and honoring the god which would end the world. Meanwhile, the Leoans believed Astrolike, the god which would end the world, was to be shunned and detested. None of the different empires in this world were truly blameless. There was no good and bad, only something in between there, that at least was the same as on Earth. The dwarves, while having saved the world once, demanded a heavy price for this, bankrupting the elves of their gold, and while the Leoans enslaved entire races, the Voron sacrificed as many to Astralich in exchange for a weapon of mass destruction called Horndal. She decided to respond to a few mails. Time flew by quickly, and eventually the dwarves were waiting outside the door. She closed her laptop and ordered Jansen to start recording. He obliged. Pressing one of the earplugs in her ear, she turned on her translator. Both the dwarves entered. One of them was older. She could clearly see that. He had a grayish beard, which almost reached down to his stomach. His body was short, albeit broad, and she was sure he was quite strong for his size. Next to him was a much younger man. He, too, had an incredibly long beard, although unlike the first man who was bald, he had long, brown hair. Both of them bowed in respect, a gesture she had to come to be familiar with. She made a low bow towards the two and gestured to them to take a seat. They did. Well, this was already going better than how the meeting with the elf went. The elder one spoke. "I am Mannerheim of Clan Bulauch, representing the Honorable Voron," he said. His voice was deep and his face stoic. The younger one then spoke. "Greetings. I am Tranararm, clansman of the Clan Dylish, and am here as representative of the great Leoans." The man didn't frown or simply be stoic. Instead, a small smile appeared on his face. "Salutations to you too, honorable emissaries." She smiled diplomatically. "I take it the long journey from you clanholds wasn't too tedious?" she asked. Mannerheim shook his head. His face was still expressionless. Tranararm shook his head as well. "Of course not. I hope accommodating us with such luxurious items wasn't too much of a strain on your logistics, seeing how you are in a completely different world," he asked. This dwarf was particularly considerate, something she didn't expect. She hadn't read many fantasy novels, however, elves usually were the diplomatic ones in those. Perhaps they were trying to get something? "Not at all. If there is anything you need, tell any servant. They'll most likely be able to get it for you," she politely responded. Mannerheim interrupted Tranararm before he could speak. "You can talk about the weather sometime later. I've got a question for you, human." The old man grumbled. Tranararm turned his head in surprise, but didn't say anything. Patricia obliged. "Very well, go ahead." Mannerheim spoke. "You're going to negotiate with literal demons and folk who have the minds of demons, also known as elves." His face twisted from a stoic, almost expressionless stance to actively frowning. He raised his voice. "It's Astralife's choice to end the world, not yours." Patricia frowned. "We're not planning to end the world, dear ambassador. Nor are we taking away your god's ability to end the world," she said. "We are trying to establish peace and stability. Have we attacked you even once?" That was a rhetorical question. The dwarves had attacked the approaching human ambassadors at Halamond, not the other way around. They had video evidence. The older dwarf smashed his fist onto the table and ignored what Patricia had just said. "You negotiate with demons, with pompous, pointy-eared fiends, and back it up with weapons which harness the power of Astralife." He yelled, "You're all heretics. If you were Voron, we'd burn you at the stake and scatter your ashes into the deepest of our long, abandoned mines." Tranararm interjected before the other dwarf could hurl any more insults at her. "What my esteemed fellow ambassador means to say is that what your kind is currently doing is seen as a grave insult to the Clay clans and the Stone King," he said. "I acknowledge that. I am even willing to offer you compensation for not inviting you earlier, as I am certain every other party will understand our current dilemma." She said that was command strategy, and she hoped it was going to pay off because talking to the races of Narivor was like trying to stop two toddlers arguing with each other. Tranararm nodded. "I see. I assume this compensation will include a place for the Clay clans in your negotiations?" he asked. Happy to not have to listen to Mannerheim rant about how humans were bad again. She nodded. "Correct. I assume you've already met Lieutenant Carlson?" she asked. Both of the dwarves nodded. However, before Tranararm could say something useful, Mannerheim chimed in. "He tried to serve us 3 instead of 4 meals. I considered punching all the blood out of him right then and there. What a vile, hateful, revolting blasphemer. He preached. All things considered, he would have made an excellent Christian preacher during the Crusades. He continued his shouting. To make this even worse, he asked what we wanted to drink. The dumb pig even suggested wine. Tranararm interrupted him. We are familiar with him, although I would recommend you assign someone a bit more familiar with dwarven customs. We, of course, wouldn't want our nation's diplomatic relationships to be ruined by a simple misinterpretation. The man said. Patricia, hoping to placate the dwarves, nodded. Of course, that will be done. I will also make the courier deliver the necessary documents, she said. Tranararm smiled. Very well. Tracurius woke up, still exhausted. He quickly got out of bed and turned on the lights. Today was a grand day. He would report his success to his liege. He would become a famed diplomat, and his portrait would be hung in the Hall of Fame, together with figures such as Justin, Dervanita, and Questus. He would be the youngest there, being a mere 40 years of age. Some of them were 100 years old when they earned their place there. He was only 40. He felt so accomplished. He succeeded. If his parents existed, they'd be proud of him, surely. And he himself was very proud of himself. Everyone who mattered was proud of him. Then a courier came walking in. His knights allowed her entrance. Tracurius stood up to greet the courier. She bowed in respect, and although out of breath began to speak. Sir, the dwarves, they... She was breathing heavily. Tracurius inspected her face. She had blonde hair and bright orange eyes. They're demanding entrance to the negotiations, she said. All of Tracurius' pride and sense of accomplishment suddenly vanished, leaving behind only anger, disappointment, and bitterness. Right, he said harshly. He punched the wall with his right hand, doing nothing but hurting his hand. He cursed out in pain. Bloody dwarves should have killed them all a long time ago, he yelled. If he failed now, he would be dismissed by his liege. His career would be over. He would have to sell himself into slavery, as his reputation was forever ruined. He cursed and cursed and cursed a little more. His anger became all the more ferocious and bright. You're dismissed, he said loudly and clearly. He turned his towards the knights. With me, I will see to it that this is dealt with. His voice was harsher than normal, and the knights obediently followed. The courier quickly scurried out of the room, Tracurius and his knights following in pursuit. They marched through the hallways, rooms and corridors on the castle. Anyone who got in their way were rudely and violently pushed away. Tracurius wasn't in the mood for niceties. Eventually they reached the door to the red-roofed building. There were 2 humans in those power armor suits. When Tracurius's knights tried to push them aside, they didn't even flinch. In one fell swoop, the 2 guards pushed the knights away with little to no effort. Halt! State your business! One of them bellowed. The guards raised their strange contraptions. Tracurius took a step forward. We're here about a diplomatic incident, one of such gargantuan proportions that you cannot deny us the privilege of rectifying it, he shouted. The guards weren't convinced. Access denied. The guard simply said, unless you have a direct order granted to you by an ambassador or an admiral or general, you are not permitted access to the diplomatic quarters of the United Leagues of Earth. The guard's mechanical voice bellowed out. Tracurius' face turned red in anger. The sheer ego of these lowly peasants, his blood boiling at the thought, I demand Before he could finish, 2 dwarves walking out of the building, a younger one and a bald older one. He averted his gaze to the 2. You 2! He yelled at the top of his lungs. This was personal now. His honor, his reputation was at stake. The 2 dwarves looked up at him, seemingly unimpressed. Yes, fellow ambassador, the younger one said in a calm tone. Tracurius clenched his fist, anger swelling up throughout him. His livelihood was at stake, his career, his honor, his pride. "I demand you retract your invitation to next week's negotiations," he yelled. The younger dwarf responded calmly. However, the bald, older one also clenched his fist. "You too were invited, weren't you?" he asked. "Isn't it only fair that—" The older one interjected. "You want to challenge me? Then do so, heretic!" His voice bellowed out of his relatively short body. "You want me to draw blood? Then so I will," he once again yelled. Tricurius stood firmly. His career was at stake, maybe even his life. Failure wouldn't be tolerated, especially failure by a lowborn. "Should I be scared, dwarf? Should I now turn around in fear?" he yelled back. He felt an anger so pure and bright it would most likely consume him. The dwarf grinned. "I challenge you to a duel? Refuse me and be forever outcast due to your cowardice?" He said, "You speak of your superiority. Let us see how that holds up, vile, corrupted peasant," he said mockingly. Tricurius wasn't an expert in swordsmanship. On the contrary, he learnt magic to avoid it. Whatever option he chose would most likely lead to either his reputation being destroyed or potentially his life being taken. However, he was a diplomat. The destruction of his reputation might as well be the destruction of his life. Embracing his eventual end, Tricurius nodded. "Very well, then. How about tomorrow, so that we both have time to get our blades ready?" he proposed. The older dwarf nodded and grinned even harder. "To the death, yes?" he said. "Why should one of us die over this petty disagreement? I'm sure you don't want to die just yet." Tricurius tried to argue. "Right. Then whoever wins gets to attend the negotiations. How about that?" The older dwarf said. Beside him, the younger dwarf was staring at him in disbelief. "Maybe this isn't such a good idea. Dwarven-elven relations are already strained, you fool," the younger one said. The older one pushed him away. "Yes?" His fury turned into sorrow when he realized what he had just done. He had doomed the Imperium, his reputation, and his life. He could have just chosen one. He was a failure. With a great deal of reluctance and sorrow, nodded. "Yes," he said somberly. He had just sealed his fate. After the encounter, he retreated to his room, utterly depressed. "Sir, maybe we should show you a few basic swordsmanship techniques," one of his knights asked. He shook his head. "It's all useless," he said. "I've not just sealed my fate, but the fate of imperial human relations. Maybe you'd prefer a spear, a battle axe, or perhaps a war hammer. You can choose any weapon." The knight said. "You can choose any weapon, like that was going to help." Then it hit him. Any weapon. He grinned. Humans had weapons which could blow someone's brains out and didn't require much effort to use. He had a plan. "One of you, call Carlson. I've got a plan," he enthusiastically said. A few minutes later, there was Carlson. Tricurius had to be very, very careful. He didn't want to sound too demanding or worse, desperate. Tricurius and his two knights walked up to the man, who was looking rather exhausted and tired. "Lieutenant Carlson." Tricurius smiled and waved his hand. The lieutenant gave a tired and somber smile back. "Yes, Ambassador?" he politely asked. "Lieutenant, I'm afraid I've gotten into a problematic situation you might be able to help me with," the elf said. Carlson raised an eyebrow. "I'm not an ambassador, sir. Officially, I'm a liaison," he said factually. "However, I could get you an audience with a diplomat." He proceeded to say, "I'm afraid that this issue is quite urgent, and if it is not resolved, the consequences could be devastating for all civilization." Tricurius said. That was technically true. The Imperium was civilization, and this was a tragedy for the Imperium. Then again, weren't the dwarves a civilization too? Tricurius said within his head. Number he wasn't a heretic. The priesthood, the nobility, they taught him the truth. Nothing good occurred before Ryman's conquests. Everything was chaos, barbarism, and tribalism. Ryman's legacy, the Imperium, upheld all virtues so dear to all reasonable men. Honorable emissary, what is so urgent that it cannot abide by the laws everything and everyone abides by? Carlson asked. Death is. Tricurius said as he braced himself for the incoming tide of questions. Death? Carlson inquisitively stated. Death. Tricurius affirmed, Not for me, of course. I am perfectly capable of defending myself. That was a complete lie, and he knew it. Then he made another educated guess, that these humans didn't duel people, and thus didn't know the rules of duels. You see, a diplomat in my service who also happens to be the son of a very influential duke has been challenged to a duel. Then I urge you to cancel the duel, Carlson said firmly. Firstly, dueling is not allowed within human embassies or territory. He sounded like he was quoting something. That was specifically mentioned in the multiple treaties that you explicitly signed. That was bad. While yes, he did know it was technically not allowed, it was also technically not allowed in the Imperium. He had thought it was a rule which wasn't enforced, one which was for all intents and purposes dead. However, it wasn't. Lieutenant, I think you do not understand what implications canceling a duel might have. He said clearly, so that the lieutenant couldn't be mistaken. If I would cancel this duel, the man would be seen as a craven, one devoid of the natural and good virtues crucial to a successful career, not just as a soldier, but also as a diplomat. Carlson nodded. Very well, then we will forcibly cancel it, he said. He turned around. Wait. Tricurius said. Carlson slowly turned around again to face the elf and his entourage. I have a different suggestion. Tricurius said. Carlson looked completely unimpressed. And that is? He asked. We will grant you innumerable concessions in next week's negotiations, on one condition. Tricurius said. He was starting to feel nervous. This wasn't going as planned. I wish to borrow one of your military contraptions. Carlson shook his head. I am no diplomat. However, I can tell you one thing. This ludicrous plan of yours is bound to fail. Carlson said harshly. That would a blatant violation of several vital ULE laws, something which cannot be permitted under any circumstance. Tricurius muttered several curses under his breath. He had to improvise. If they detested dueling, maybe he could use this as an advantage. The dwarf proposed the duel. If he could get him warned or maybe even arrested, that would be quite the accomplishment. I must tell you something, and I put trust in you that you do not let this information fall into the wrong hands, he said. Carlson looked up with interest. The dwarves instigated this duel. They provoked the young man, who is simply a victim. If you want to enforce your laws, enforce them on him, not me or the innocent young man, he said. Carlson nodded. Very well. I'll make sure all this information is relayed to the ambassador. He paused for a few seconds, after which he continued speaking. However, we'll also listen to the dwarves' side of the story. Tricurius nodded as the lieutenant walked away. His eyes gleamed of victory. He, however, had also realized a second thing, besides his own greatness, of course. That thing being that he needed to change something. Up until this point, he had believed in a truth so universal and undeniable to most elves, even thinking about disputing was the highest form of heresy. That truth was that elves were above and beyond every other creature, that there were no exceptions to this rule, and the most jarring part, that this superiority was to be enforced with military force if needed. However, Tricurius thought he had found an exception to this seemingly universal rule. It truly pained him to say it, But these humans weren't just militarily, economically, and diplomatically superior. They might as well be equal on an individual basis as well. They were as, if not more, educated as most urban elves. Their bodies were as powerful as an Ammonite, without having the downside of being as dull and slow as one. But were they really dull and slow? Tricurius had never asked himself that question. That would be the highest degree of heresy and treason. However, he had already committed that thought crime, and yet he didn't see some god striking him down where he stood as he was taught would happen when he was a child. What was so criminal about thinking about it anyway? Didn't each freeman hold control over their own mind? That was what the church taught when it came to temptations. You hold the highest authority over your own mind, and as a duke is obligated to care for his people, so are you to care for your mind and thoughts. What about the dwarves? The diplomatic, younger dwarf he had met didn't look like the stereotypical, permanently drunk, warmongering fool he thought he would be. He would have to further inquire about all of this, to think it out. It was severely clouding his mind, maybe even his judgment. Indeed, the more he thought about this, the stranger it became. He had been tempted to think this out, to this ratiocinate, highly heretical situation many times. However, he always clung to the things he was taught when he was but a boy. Tell the truth, follow the gods, be obedient, and the gods control your soul as they do your mind. It didn't make sense. Sometimes they told him to think a certain way, only to contradict it themselves a moment later. He gestured his guards to leave and closed the door. He looked at the room, which only reminded him of the heretical thoughts he harbored. These humans had such majestic technology and such awe-inducing machines, and yet he didn't know a lot about them. One of those unknowns being their philosophies, their politics, and economics. He had to educate himself. These weren't just lesser pieces of filth, maybe nobody was. However, these humans in particular weren't. And so the day of the duel came. Tricurius, once again, lay in the large bed. Before he could convince himself to stay in bed for 5 more minutes, he heard a knocking sound on his door. He swiftly leaped out of the bed and put on something presentable. "One moment, please," he said. He wasn't presentable in the slightest, but he didn't expect to need to be presentable. There was a good chance the dwarf had come to rage at him for canceling the duel. Except he didn't. The humans canceled it. "Please, come in," Tricurius said politely. To his surprise, the angry, older dwarf didn't come. Rather, the younger, much more pleasant one did. "Tranararm, pleased to make your acquaintance." The short man smiled and made a deep bow, something unusual, as they were equals. Tricurius reciprocated the gesture with a shorter bow. "Greetings, diplomat. What is it that you wish to discuss, or do you wish to schedule a meeting?" "I'm here to thank you for canceling the duel." The short man said, "Honorable diplomat, I didn't cancel the duel. The humans did." He said, "Although I too am happy to prevent this useless show of violence." The last part he said to hopefully put the dwarf at ease. It seemed like it worked. "Ah, then we're like-minded," he said happily. "There is, however, a second matter I wish to discuss." Tricurius raised one of his permanently frowning eyebrows in curiosity. "And that is?" he asked. "See, I suspect that some other party will enter the negotiations. I know who this party is and what they want, and I'll give this very interesting information to you on one condition," the dwarf said. Tricurius's mind swiftly jumped to the conclusion that this dwarf wanted something from him to advance his own position. "And what might this condition be?" he asked. "It's quite simple." The dwarf said, "There is a very good chance you will promoting the classic elven policy of trying to get the humans to not trade with us." Tranararm paused for a moment, after which he continued, "I wish you to abandon this policy. To tell your liege that it was a topic you couldn't push through. Tranararm waited a few seconds to let it sink in. On that condition, I will give you all the information you desire about this new party, which will be here in exactly 3 days. Tracurius's mind raced to different conclusions and explored the consequences a choice such as this might have. Perhaps he could demand a bit more in exchange for the concession. That would be unbalanced. I propose altering the deal a bit, he said. The dwarf titled his head in interest. I'll not propose not trading with your people. In exchange for that, I ask of you to do the same. He said, you'll not disencourage the humans from the trading with the Imperium. You're demanding 2 things for just 1. That's unbalanced. Tranararm said, I agree not to disencourage trade with the Imperium on the condition that you won't form an alliance with the Voron and Ambassador Mannerheim. He didn't have any plans to do so anyways. The reason Tranararm was mentioning it was because the Voron and Lyoans didn't get along. Their division was Tracurius' ticket to a good deal. Tracurius nodded. Agreed, now the information. Tranararm grinned. I'll get a courier to deliver it to you, he said, as he turned around and closed the door behind him. Tracurius also turned around towards his bed and breathed in deeply. He didn't show it, but that wasn't just unexpected. It was nerve-wracking. At least it wasn't infuriating or exhausting like the experience of Mannerheim yelling at him might have been. He walked over towards his bed and looked at himself in the mirror. Maybe he should put on actual clothes instead of the robe he quickly put on. Using that miraculous human contraption was also probably a good idea. He grabbed a towel and headed over to the shower. After he finished with that, he put on some garments befitting his prestigious position. He groomed his hair to look clean and finished it all off by putting on his rather fashionable boots. Hygiene was a very valued thing within imperial society. Only a slave wore rags and smelled of sweat, blood, and dirt. A true imperial citizen, no matter how poor, was expected to at least bathe in one of public baths a few times a week. Unlike many savage dwarven clans, orcish tribes, and Ammoni hordes, the Imperium believed that diseases weren't a curse. Rather, they were caused by impure water. This theory had quite a bit of evidence as well. After all, if diseases didn't spread by water, how else could it be then that Riemstadt, a city infamous for its proper baths and its clean drinking water, had so few sickly people? Besides hygiene, he was also starving for a meal. He was quite sure the human canteen hall was already open, and headed to it. Along the way, he picked up his 2 loyal knights, who were already waiting outside of the entrance to the various quarters of himself and his entourage. Apparently, when he got to the dining hall, the humans had already commenced their midday meal, something they called a lunch. They said he was a bit late for a breakfast, although they could combine the 2 for something called a brunch. He was served several slices of bread, alongside a meat apparently called ham, cheese, a small layer of salad, and a red, tasteful sauce to finish it off. He wondered how exactly the humans got all these ingredients. Tracurius was convinced the Ammoni farms surrounding the castle intentionally chose to only grow the most bland and bitter drap there was. The human cook was leaning against the counter, and curiosity got the better of Tracurius. "Excuse me?" he said. The cook's head perked up. "Yes, sir?" he politely responded. "How do you get all these ingredients from your world to ours? The journey is quite long, and I don't think these ingredients can stay ripe and fresh that long," Tracurius said. The cook sighed. "Where do I even begin?" "At the beginning," Tracurius said. That was obvious. "Right. First it is produced. Usually meat is cloned and crops are farmed all over the world," he said. Cloned. The only time he had heard that term was when he was reading books about shadow magic. It could be used to clone yourself into countless illusions that could deceive foes and encourage friends. He decided to ask more about it. Cloned. How do you clone meat? I'm a cook, not a geneticist. The cook said, however, I get the gist of it. Basically, they take an animal's cells and grow these until they become meat. An animal's cells? Tricurius asked. Right. You are stuck in the Middle Ages. The cook said, luckily I did pay attention in biology class. Cells are incredibly tiny things which make up every living being. They consist out of several parts and are the building blocks of every organism. That was quite interesting, of course, if these were the building blocks of everything, like muscle and thus meat, if they'd clone them, well, that would make quite a bit of sense. So, what happens after that? He asked. Then we alter it to remove possible diseases and to make it last longer, the cook said. How? Tricurious, simple and yet very necessary question, as this cook somehow knew more about food preservation and disease than him, an educated scholar. The cook's expression twisted to a thoughtful one. Well, you can pasteurize it, then you can also put it into a freezer or fridge to keep it cold, which also slows down how quickly it goes bad. Then there's also an array of chemicals, which can hamper the spoilage of foods. It was like the man was speaking a different language. Chemicals, pasteurization, fridge. He had never heard these strange words even once in his life. You're saying all of these things, but I've no idea what they actually mean. The cook nodded. Right. Should have expected that. He took a deep breath in. Pasteurization is cooking things up to a very high temperature to kill the bacteria within it. Before Tricurius asked what bacteria were, the man explained, bacteria are large groups of cells, but whilst cells are usually harmless, bacteria are not necessarily. They can cause diseases, infections, and the spoilage of food. So much for the idea that water spreads disease. Bacteria. What a strange word and a strange concept. Continue, he said. He wanted to know more. This reminded him when he was but an apprentice. That ravenous yearning for knowledge had returned, this time bigger and stronger. In a colder environment, things grow less quickly, bacteria included. Fridges and freezers are devices which are intentionally kept cold. The cook explained, frankly, I don't know which chemicals hamper the spoilage of food exactly. However, I can tell you that there are several which do so. After the food is processed, it is packaged. After that is done, it is transported by what I can best explain to you are massive metal horses, powered not by the power of muscle, but by an engine, and now fueled by food and water, but by nuclear energy. He said, these metal horses are what we call trucks. They are capable of carrying more, going faster, and needing to rest less than any horse. Besides, trucks, planes, and ships are also used. The cook factually stated, planes are giant metal birds which used combustion to thrust themselves forward, or something like that. Like I've already said, I'm a cook. The cook continued, the ships we use aren't made of wood, but are made of metal. They don't use sails, but instead, like planes and trucks, use engines and can transport quite a bit. Oh. That was the state Tricurius was currently in. He thought how food was created would be quite similar. How wrong he was. These humans used things his mind could not even conjure up. Their cooks understood more about the world than most elven scholars. It was frightening, humbling, and fascinating at the same time. That was a lot to take in. These humans seemed to possess powers equivalent to the greatest sorcerers. Some even equivalent to gods. Things like flight, like cloning, and like metal being able to float. So much for elven superiority, so much for the idea that they had somehow mastered this world, that they had achieved everything that was achievable. These were heretical thoughts, he was well aware of that, and yet he knew them to be true. When he was done eating his meal, he went back to his room. There he saw a courier by the door. Tricurius presumed this courier most likely carried the letter with the information he got from the dwarf. That assumption was indeed correct. He handed Tricurius the letter. When he entered, he was surprised to find that the only thing on the letter was, "Warm wind from thine palms shall reveal what I've written here." Heat-sensitive ink. The dwarf probably thought Tricurius could conjure warm winds. Indeed, he could, and so he did. After about 10 minutes of warming up the paper, the letters started to become visible. The beast-folk races, specifically the Surai, Khat, and Erismer, are arriving in 3 days. Their goal is going to be trying to impose rules on who can and cannot be taken as slave, as well as ensuring no nation will raid them for slaves anymore. The first paragraph read, "The Orcish tribes shall be attending, not just the descendants of Urigai and the descendants of Garkanog, but also the Orcish druid cults. The Urigai shall bring with them an army of 3,000, the Garkanog an army of 2,000, and the druids shall bring with them 50 healers, 50 priests, 50 sorcerers, and 1,000 soldiers." The second one reads, "That was quite interesting." Thinking quickly, Tricurius hatched a plan. These humans were against violence, to such a degree he could probably get the orcs kicked out. While he realized elves maybe weren't the greatest people on Narivor, that didn't mean he couldn't try to get the Imperium a diplomatic victory. It had been 3 days since he had arrived here. In 5 days the negotiations would happen, and the humans would have to be dealt with. Tricurius's mind was constantly occupied with thinking of how humans would react to his proposals and ideas. He himself was tasked by his liege to ensure 2 things. The first was figuring out their intentions and ensuring they wouldn't be another enemy of the Imperium. The Imperium was already fighting enemies on all fronts: Emini from the northeast, dwarves from the northwest, the Erismer from the sea, the Surai and Khat from the south, and the orcs from the east. The second was to kickstart trade and diplomatic relations with the humans. The Imperium didn't have the resources and troops to start a war with another faction, and as such, trade and peace was preferable. Tricurius himself, however, wanted to realize a third thing: to not just create truce, but a lasting peace. War with the humans would be devastating for the Imperium. The humans possessed the logistics and technologies to destroy even the most fortified cities within hours. Such a war wouldn't bring wealth and slaves, but rather destruction and sorrow. According to his watch, it was 3:19. He still had to write several letters to his liege, informing him of his findings and what he advised him to do. One thing was constantly in the back of his mind: when would the orcs arrive? That could certainly change quite a few things. If he knew when they would arrive, he could inform the humans. Seeing such a brash display of violence, the humans would surely condemn the orcs, giving him an advantage in the negotiations. Just when he was finished writing his letters and giving them to one of his couriers, a loud sound blared through the room. Red flashes of light came from a device on the ceiling. Tricurius covered his ears, yet the sound was still hearable. "All combat personnel report to battle stations immediately. Non-combatants go to your quarters and remain there until further instructions." A loud, robotic voice came from the device on the ceiling. To battle stations? They were under attack. This, of course, could be some regular bandits, however, it could also be the orcs. Tricurius grinned. There was danger. There was, however, also an opportunity. Considering the humans' technology and magicless magic, which might or might not be the same thing, he was quite certain these humans were perfectly capable of defending themselves. That would be something he wouldn't have to worry about. So, off he went. Fate favors the bold, after all. When he reached the exit to the castle, 2 heavily clad soldiers stood guarding it. He approached the men. "Guests are supposed to be in their quarters, sir." One of them firmly and yet politely said, "I have crucial information about the horde that is approaching the castle. They're orcs, not here to attack. Bringing troops to a diplomatic meeting is a strange tradition of theirs. Tricurius said, "Listen. I am aware that if the orcs continue to advance, they'd get grinded into the dirt. I'm doing this so that nobody dies." That was a complete lie. He was doing this so that he could be seen as a hero, thus gaining him some respect from the humans. "Fine then. Go in, but we'll be keeping a close eye on you," the same guard said. He trudged through the courtyard with his knights following him closely when he finally arrived at the castle's walls. There, he saw hundreds of figures clad in suits of armor gripping their magical sticks they called plasma rifles. In the distance, he could make out 3 orcish hosts, each one following each other in what almost seemed like a competition of who could reach the castle the fastest. The sun shone brightly today, and the light was reflected on the well-disciplined warriors of the orcish host's armor and shields. The orcs appeared to be disciplined enough to not tramp through the fields of crops, and instead followed the wide road out of the forest towards the castle. What he assumed to be an officer immediately ran up to him. "All guests are to be in their room, sir." He politely said, "I am aware. I, however, have some rather crucial about the encroaching orcish hosts." Tricurius said, "Trust me. If I thought they'd pose any danger, I would have fled by now." The officer nodded. "I have no idea how you got past military police, but go speak to Colonel Romano. He's the one standing up without a rifle." The officer pointed to the colonel, and Tricurius immediately walked up to him. A thought creeped into his mind. While walking, Romano sounded like an imperial name. He even knew a lad by the name of Romano. Then again, maybe it had a completely different meaning in the human language. "What is a diplomat doing here?" the colonel yelled out as he removed his helmet. One thing that Tricurius noticed was that none of these humans looked any day past their prime. Elves were the longest-lived species, with a grand 300 years. Then came the dwarves with 200 years, the Emini and orcs would be lucky if they lived for 100 years, and the beast folk usually only reached 40 or 50, although the fact that most of them were killed as soon as they couldn't work anymore certainly played a part in that. The colonel, which Tricurius assumed to be an elderly and high-ranking man, looked no older than Carlson or the cooks he had met. Maybe it was another human technology. The colonel had a slightly tanned skin and hazel-brown eyes. He sported a rather fabulous mustache and had blackish hair. Tricurius had spent enough time thinking, though. He had to respond. Tricurius stood up and pointed towards the orcish hosts. These hordes, they come in peace, bringing soldiers with them as gifts and guards, not soldiers to conquer or kill. Tricurius said, "Their warmongering culture demands that they do this. I advise you to talk to them before you understandably mow them all down." The colonel looked towards Tricurius and then towards the soldiers. "Don't worry. They'll only fire if I command them to do so." He cleared his throat and put on his helmet. He touched a few buttons on his helmet, and Tricurius could make out that Romano was speaking. He put off his helmet and pressed a strange iron thing in his ear. "The diplomat is coming. You can explain to her how we're supposed to make contact to thousands of medieval LARPers." Tricurius didn't know what that last part meant. However, he did know that he had to come up with a plan of action. The best idea would probably be riding out to them with an armored escort, and simply approaching them. However stupid that might sound, it had worked countless times in the past. The orcs kept on advancing and were finally out of the forest. It was impressive how far these humans could see. Elves were renowned for their excellent eyesight. The fact that these humans could see that far was truly a testament to either their magic and technologies or their impressive biology. Patricia finally arrived, followed by the guard he also saw when he was meeting her. I was informed there were orcs wishing to talk to me. Yet, I only see soldiers, she said to the colonel. Romano nodded. According to this elf, this is the orc's way of greeting diplomats. He said, I admit it seems quite strange to me. It is strange. It's also the reason for countless wars. In my opinion, the fact they haven't changed it is idiotic. Tricurius said, however, if you don't want another war, then not shooting them down where they stand might be the best option. Sir, the orcs have halted in front of the castle's gates. A robotic voice sounded. That was one of the armored soldiers. Romano turned his head and nodded. Acknowledged. It would be illogical for them to attack a castle without any siege engines, especially when facing an unknown foe. Patricia said, Don't power armor helmets have sound amplifiers? She asked. They do. Do you want me to ask what their intentions are? Romano asked. Patricia nodded. I do, Colonel. One small problem. We don't have enough data on the Orcish language for the auto-translator to do anything with it. Romano said. You could try to speak in Elvish. It's quite a widespread language. At least one of them should be able to speak it, Tricurius suggested. Agreed, honorable diplomat. Do you perhaps have any information on the Orcish language? Patricia asked. Tricurius nodded. I brought an entire dictionary with me. I intended to study it, as I don't know the language yet. Then we'll study that after this encounter. Patricia decreed, Romano, go ahead. Romano put on his helmet. State your intentions. The sound boomed out of the helmet. Diu. The orcs seemed to look at each other in confusion until one stepped up. We come to speak, he said in poorly pronounced Elvish. Romano looked at Tricurius and Patricia. I advise against letting the entire Orcish army in, he said. Patricia acknowledged his advice with a slight nodding of her head. I plan on heeding that advice. Ask them to bring a small host of soldiers and their diplomats, she said. Very well. Bring your diplomats and a small unit of guards, Romano very loudly declared. The orcs quickly started talking amidst themselves. After a few minutes, they formed 3 different groups. The first of the groups were clad in little to no armor and had to dismount their horses prior to forming the groups. In their skin were etched many tattoos. The second group wore heavy armor and had long spears alongside a round iron shield. Upon their helmets were mounted blood-red plumes. One of them carried a war banner. The third group was the smallest. It consisted out of only 50 or so men. All of them carried branches of wood that Tricurius assumed to be magical staves. They were all clad in greenish robes, and most sported thick, gray beards. I guess orcs and humans have different definitions of small, Patricia said as she watched the groups come forth. We only have room for 200 more people. That's assuming nobody else will show up. Romano said, Should I order them to form groups of 25? Patricia nodded. That would be advisable, she said. Please reform your 3 groups into groups of 25, Romano said. The soldiers next to him had taken up less aggressive positions and looked a lot less eager to kill them all than just a few minutes ago. Most of the orcs seemed to agree with Romano's idea, except the druids. The druids most likely weren't used to being commanded. They were a completely independent element of orcish society after all. They had their own leaders, rituals, and traditions. If an orc showed any magical talent, they'd be sent to the local elder druid, who would educate him from an incredibly early age. The orcs had many gods. Every tribe, city, and castle had their own god. However, there were a few which were venerated in almost every orcish settlement. There was Turgayor El, goddess of youth, the earth and farmers; Diagur, god of war, birth and death; and Gul, god of the arts, sacrifice, and perfection. There were also lesser gods, Bulbus, the sun god, Kaera, goddess of sleep, and Nakeacht, the nature god. In spite of there being many local gods, Orcish religious practices were mostly consistent. The Druids made sure of that. All of the major gods, and some of the minor ones, all had their own festivals and feasts. The most important of these being the Turgayor Elnoria. It was the celebration of a successful harvest and involved sacrificing people to Turgayor El, the chief of the Orcish pantheon and goddess of youth, earth, and farmers. The Druids bickered amongst each other before, unfortunately, preparing themselves to bicker with the humans. One of the Druids came forth. "We demand to be let in with more people. It isn't up to you to decide how many men we are allowed to bring." The Druid yelled in slightly better, albeit still horribly pronounced, Elvish. Patricia sighed. "This man isn't just a clown. He's the whole bloody circus." She paused briefly. "Tell them that no, they don't decide how many men we feed, we house, and we allow within a human embassy," Patricia said towards Romano. Romano nodded. "You are aware that if you do not comply with our demands, we are allowed to not grant you access at all." The noise boomed out loudly. The Druid didn't seem content with that answer. They once again started talking amongst themselves. Another Druid came forth. Tricurius strained his eyes and managed to catch a glimpse of him. He was certainly strange for an orc. His skin was browner and more elven-like than the decisively green most orcs had. His ears weren't pointed on both sides, but pointed only on one. His build was slimmer and leaner than most orcs, and his eyebrows were permanently frowning, like elven ones. A half-breed, perhaps? "We agree. However, do not mistake this for our submission to your authority," the half-breed yelled in much, much better Elvish. A few minutes later, 3 groups of soldiers, one of 20, another of 21, and of course the Druids with exactly 25. Romano ordered the gates to be opened with one ferocious yell towards the Emini controlling the gate. While this was going on, Patricia, Carlson, and another logistics officer were discussing how to feed these men. Although apparently food wasn't the problem, they could just ask for more. The issue was how to house them. These soldiers had some tents with them. However, how did they ensure they wouldn't raid the neighboring Emini farms, or they didn't plunder the warehouse, which was in desperate need of expansion? Thus, it was decided that Romano's battalion would be constantly patrolling the neighboring farms, as well as the castle. They also made a remark about it being strange that a colonel was leading a battalion. After Tricurius was done eavesdropping on people, he went downstairs and towards the gates. A few minutes later, Patricia, Carlson, and Romano were also gathered in front of the gate. This presented a quite interesting opportunity. He had a chance to alter humanity's first impression of the orcs. Through the gate came 3 delegates, each flanked with at least 2 guards. Many soldiers, diplomats, and druids followed them into the castle. They were met by my own knights and a few human soldiers. "Greetings, fellow diplomats," Patricia said, as she performed a low bow. "You should perform a deep bow for me," the half-breed said, as he snobbishly put his head up. "I am your better, after all." Even he himself wasn't so unapologetically arrogant and sure of his superiority when he introduced himself, Tricurius thought. Patricia responded by raising an eyebrow. "How are you my better?" she asked. "You have brought but a few hundred or thousands troops. You haven't even brought druids. Of whatever your race's equivalent is, you're either an idiot or poor," he said. He pointed towards his own entourage of druids and knights. "Me, on the other hand," he grinned, "I've brought an entire army." What gave this man an entire nation worth of confidence, Tricurius wondered. It was like he wasn't aware that the devices these soldiers were holding could pulverize any of his druids or warriors. Maybe he thought they were magical devices, and that their runes would absorb the magic, in which case he was just wrong and slightly arrogant. If he, however, thought that these humans entered a completely alien world without any plan of action or strength, he wasn't just wrong and arrogant, he was also a fool. Doran, antagonizing yet another faction isn't what we're here to do, another orc said. Not a druid, though. The man was clad in little to no armor. Instead, he had tattoos on his head and his chest, and a thick, blood-red cloak wrapped around his shoulders. Another orc, this one clad in heavy steel armor with runes etched onto the breastplate and gauntlets, nodded his head in agreement. If they are weaker, we will conquer them, not kill them by talking to them, he said in poorly pronounced Elvish. By Turgayor, do you see them? The half-breed, apparently called Doran, asked the other orcs. They've barely figured out metallurgy with those impractical spears. Of course we're... Doran's rant was interrupted by the heavily armored orc approaching him and punching him hard in the gut. Very hard. So hard even that Doran dropped to the floor in anguish, wallowing in pain and crying out the armored orc's name, who was named Fergoon. Within the blink of an eye, Doran stood up and conjured a flame spell in his right hand. How dare you interrupt a druid? He asked Fergoon. I am Turgayor El's representative on Earth. I receive instructions from Bulbus, Diagor, and Gul. He clenched his left hand into a fist. By punching and insulting me, you've punched and insulted them. He growled at Fergoon, who was slowly starting to back off. You insulted their worldly representative, and so you shall pay the price of this world. Patricia glanced at Romano, who in turn looked at her with worry in his face. No need to settle this with senseless violence. Your duel will only prove who is better at inflicting pain, not who is right, Patricia said. And what are you primitives going to do about it? Doran yelled at her. Patricia once again looked at Romano, who was already ready to act, should it be necessary. You are subordinate to ULE laws, and according to those laws, assaulting another person on ULE territory is punishable with 1 to 10 years in prison and a fine up to 20,000, she said. This didn't disencourage Doran, who Tricurius was pretty sure was so confident in his superiority that he believed he could defeat them all. Tricurius himself now decided to intervene. Ambassador, I don't know your plan, but the armor the humans are wearing can tank your fireball with ease, and before you make the argument that you could defeat them, those instruments they're holding can blow you into 1,000,000 different pieces, Tricurius said. Imperial, you don't have the forces of the gods on your side. Your petty magic is fueled not by the divine, but by mortal and thus fallible ideas, Doran said snobbishly. Now let me deal with this fool who dared insult the messenger of the gods. Doran turned his head towards Fergoon, who in response drew his sword. Enough, Patricia yelled. Restrain him. He has repeatedly and intentionally ignored my warnings and has broken the law by threatening with death and bodily harm. I'm afraid that continuing this discussion might result in bodily harm, she said, as she gestured to Romano to order the soldiers to restrain Doran. Romano did exactly that. Doran unleashed his fireball, and it hit one of the soldiers. To my surprise, the metal didn't melt. Doran then lifted up Fergoon and telepathically smashed him into the same soldier, to little effect. Set your weapons to stun. Lethal force isn't required, Romano yelled out as he put on his helmet. Tricurius quickly cast a spell to drain some of Doran's ternitia that would weaken him for a minute or two, enough time for the soldiers to subdue him. Tricurius's plan did indeed seem to work. As the druid was trying to catch his breath, one out of the dozen or so soldiers fired their weapon. It hit. The druid collapsed to the ground, unconscious and subdued. Elves were pompous creatures, taught from a young age to feel nothing but utter disgust and hatred towards the other races. For it was the elves who civilized half of Narivor, for it was the elves who built the bridges, sewers, and cities the other races toiled in. Therefore the elves were superior. It seemed, however, that not just pure-blooded elves were taught this delusion, but half-elves as well. Maybe it was something in their blood, maybe it was that everyone around them said so. But Tricurius was convinced that was a view all creatures with a drop of elven blood shared. Tricurius turned his gaze to the downed druid. A group of other druids now stepped up. The eldest of them was also the shortest. He had burning red eyes and a long gray beard. For where the dragon's ear is, its teeth linger nearby. The old man spoke. Fergun got on his feet with a lot of complaining and grunting. He took off his helmet and sheathed his sword. "That wasn't an honorable Valhome, old man," he commented. Patricia and Romano shot him a quizzical look, seemingly confused by the proverb. Tricurius, though, knew what he was talking about. Do not speak if you cannot back up your words with violence, and do not call one inferior if you cannot prove your superior. Orcish society revolved around might, battle, and strength, and this was yet another example of that. The proverb itself was allegedly said by Astrain, the Orcish version of Astralish. Doran should have challenged you to a Valhome, although you've proven yourself worthy, human. The elder said, Now let us discuss diplomacy. My name is Eilidi of the Vuvili clan. The elder made a low bow. Patricia and Romano were still completely and utterly confused. There was a good chance they were confused about the Valhome and the clan system. A Valhome was a duel arranged in a secluded place, where friends and family would be invited to watch, as well as a Culligar, a judge to oversee the combat. Valhomes could be arranged for a myriad of reasons, although it was mostly because of the other party making an insult towards the person's family or status. Valhomes could be lethal or non-lethal depending on the severity of the insult or action. It is said the first Valhome was organized by Astrain against the conformity and stability of the universe itself. When he won this Valhome, he declared that change was the emperor of all emperors and fate, as well as the decider of fates. The Orcish clan system also originated from Astrain, although this time it was his defeat that brought them about. Following Astrain's victory against conformity, the blood he had lost became the various gods of the various races we see today. Those gods, however, as they weren't as powerful as Astrain, decided to specialize themselves. Astrain was firmly against this and declared they were trying to embody the same stability, conformity, and contentedness that he had sought to defeat. The gods that created the orcs decided that a few specialized warriors should lead, and that while greatness could be inherited, it should still be proven. However, one that had no legacy of great deeds could accomplish no great deeds themselves. Astrain despised this idea and declared if the gods wouldn't remove it, he would make them remove it. This challenge was accepted by the gods, and with sweat, blood, and tears the gods won over Astrain due to their specialization and their discipline. Now that the ever-fickle Astrain was put in its place, the Orcish gods were free to do as they pleased. And so, they declared that those with a heritage of greatness would form a clan and take control over a tribe, and so they did. Tricurius recounted the story mentally as he thought it might be useful. The best way to defeat your enemy is to know them, after all. His train of thought was cut short by Patricia formulating an actual response. She responded with a low bow. A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Eilidi, although I do advise you to not use violence on ULE territory. She warned him sternly. It seemed like Eilidi heeded the warning, though, as he immediately nodded his head. Of course. You won the Valhome. If anything, you asking us such a minor favor is a sign of your forgiveness, he said. Patricia looked pleased with that answer. Excellent. I suppose I should introduce myself. I am Patricia Williams, ambassador of the ULE to UDA1, also known as Narivore. She continued, Before we continue, I will be needing you to read and agree to the following contract. She gestured to Carlson, who gave her a few sheets of paper. She proceeded to hand them to the various emissaries. The druids instantly began reading. The contracts were in Elvish, and Carlson barely had time to get them, as when the orcs were spotted, he immediately writing them. Or that was at least what Tricurius assumed. The half-naked tattooed man, however, seemed to have a lot more difficulty. And Fergoon was still recovering from being thrown against what seemed like an iron wall, although Tricurius very much doubted he could read anyway. The tattooed man asked for one of his companions, who did seem to be capable of reading Elvish. The man translated the document, and the tattooed man nodded. "Me agree," he said after the translator of the document, in very dumbed-down and badly pronounced Elvish. Fergoon asked one of the druids for help. Before the druid helped, however, he first took the time to explain why this was the reason druids were so important and deserved more influence. After which, he translated the document for Fergoon, who gave his verbal consent a moment later. It took more than an hour for the entire Orcish entourage to give their written or verbal consent, after which Carlson gave them a map of the castle and gave them watches, as well as a time to meet Patricia and the day and hour of the negotiations. After the meeting, Tricurius went to his quarters to pick up the Orcish dictionary, and then proceeded to deliver it to Carlson, who thanked him for his contribution and hastily ran off with it. Maybe his cooperation would earn him a favor. It should, in his opinion. Shortly after he went to the cafeteria and picked up a cup of tea, there he also met several orcs, who were seemingly pestering the human cooks. He decided to listen to their conversation. "Raw meat, that's what we need. Not your pitiful censored version," one of the orcs yelled at the cook. "I can just smell that you poured something over this fine piece of meat." He yelled again. The human looked tired, disappointed, and yet not intimidated. "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you—" The cook was cut short by another orc marching up to him. He seemed to flex his chest muscles and make himself intentionally bigger. The human was still unimpressed. He then raised his fist and flexed his arm. "You want this in your face?" he asked as he pointed towards his fist. "Last warning, stop pestering me or I'll call the guards." The cook said, "And I'm sure you don't want to end up like your comrade." He was most likely referencing Doran. The orc let out a rumbling laughter and bared his sharp, tusk-like teeth in anticipation. "I'd gladly fight your pitiful idiots. They need armor, I don't." He balled his fists and prepared to hit the human behind the counter, who simply took a step back. For a moment, Tricurius considered not intervening. But why shouldn't he? It had dawned on him that these humans were most likely the closest thing to what the Imperium would consider perfection, and yet they followed completely different ethics and ideas to get there. It was that moment he realized that the Imperium wasn't just imperfect. It wasn't just outclassed militarily, economically, and technologically. It was also outclassed morally. Tricurius had been reevaluating his youth and education for a few days now, and, while it was hard to accept, he had been taught falsehood after falsehood. And why would elven morality, which said that as the powerful define morality, morality is power, be anything but another falsehood? Again, it was full of contradictions. When elven children were mistreated at the hands of dwarves, the dwarves were wrong. That didn't make sense. The dwarves defined morality as they were the most powerful in that situation, and yet the Imperium cast the dwarves as evil and impure. Frankly, Tricurius didn't really know what morality was if it wasn't power, but he knew one thing, that either the idea that morality is power is so flawed it cannot be followed without being evil, or the much more reasonable alternative, that morality wasn't power. For now, he set up a quite rudimentary and simple foundation of morality. That any action or person who intentionally inflicts harm on another person is less moral than one who causes pleasure or kindness. The orcs were maybe the most powerful in this situation, and yet he felt a moral duty, an obligation to stand up and defend the cook, even if he could simply call the guards, which he would do anyway. Following his line of thinking, the orcs were trying to inflict harm upon somebody without a proper reason for doing so. As such, they were clearly in the wrong. With one decisive motion, Tricurius stood up. "Halt!" he bellowed to the orcs, pestering the cook. The orcs turned their heads to Tricurius, whose resolve was still strong. If things got really violent, he could always conjure a fireball. He reminded himself of that fact. "Well, little elf, are you going to try and defend your fellow civilized highfalutin?" The biggest one yelled out to him. "Violence isn't preferable, although if you start a fight, I'll end it." Tricurius replied as he conjured up a fireball in his right hand. The cook seemed to quickly contact the guards by tapping on the iron stud in his ears. Within a few seconds, Tricurius heard the thundering sound of several iron-clad men entering the room. Upon hearing them, Tricurius doused his fireball. "Sion! Seor!" The guard bellowed out in what sounded like Orcish. It seems like they actually did something useful with his dictionary. The largest orc's grin slowly faded away as he realized that he messed up. He was currently surrounded by over 5 guards, and Tricurius himself, who, if necessary, could easily fry the orc. "Karth leorg, mach mein gear, attain mein turgi diogotos," the orc yelled back. "Nach, laida u el ituar meeg dur," the guard yelled back at him. The orc simply let out an annoyed grunt and stormed out of the room. Tricurius let out a sigh of relief and sat down once more. The guards came running up to him a few seconds later. He felt their heavy armor shake the ground as they walked. Their helmets reflected the light of the magical torches within the cafeteria, and yet the heavy armor did not weigh them down. On the contrary, it only seemed to make them faster and stronger. "Ambassador Tricurius," the armored guard said, "would you please explain what happened here?" He said. His helmet made it sound monotone, yet firm. The ambassador nodded. "But of course," he responded. He stroked his chin in thought. "I decided to dine alone for once, when the orcs also entered." He inspected the guard and then raised his hands. "Not that I have a problem with orcs, but their culture is strange." The armored guard nodded and turned his head to the cook. "Does he speak true?" he then asked. The cook made an affirming gesture. "Yes, he does," he said, "although I don't know what the ambassador means with that they've a strange culture." He added, "Both the Emoni and the orcs have something called the Vialiv in Orcish or Vuan in Emoni." Tricurius clarified, "It's a set of rules which dictates what a person should eat and how they should eat it." "What does that have to do with this?" the guard asked. "Perhaps it's their bodies, their culture, or their gods, but the Emoni and orcs are capable of meat without cooking it first. Barbaric, I know." Tricurius couldn't help but add that last little comment. The cook now spoke up. "And let me guess, eating cooked meat is sacrilegious, or something?" he asked. Tricurius nodded. To quote it, "Swear upon thine swords and spears, sons of the raven, and, or crow, depending if you follow the Emoni or Orcish saga, that thou shalt eat only what thine hath hunted, and that thou shalt not desecrate, just like thou would not desecrate the corpse of thine deceased, quite gruesome, if I do say so myself." "Right. So I assume you offered the orc a piece of cooked meat?" the guard asked. The cook confirmed that with a nod. "Yes. If I'd known, I would have." The guard raised his hand. "You would have given them raw meat!" He sighed. Right, Kruger. Achebe, stay here. I and De Leon will talk to the orcs. Yes, Sergeant, the others responded in unison. 2 of the soldiers walked away, while the 2 others went to guard the front of the cafeteria. Tricurius allowed himself to relax and took a sip of his tea. He looked at his watch, 16:34. He'd probably leave at 5 and then have some time left to write reports and relax a bit before having dinner with his entourage. He took another sip of his tea, and a thought seeped into his mind. Which gods did the humans worship? For everything he knew about humanity, he knew so very little about their culture, religion, and history. If he had to form a cohesive conclusion from all the information he currently possessed, he'd say they were materialistic, and yet generous, knowledgeable, although unwise. He took another sip of his tea. He looked inside the cup. He drank it all up. Maybe he should gather more information about humans and their culture, but who to ask? He scratched his chin. He could simply ask Carlson. But why would he need more knowledge about them? They'd think he was trying to spy on them. He could pretend like it was to prevent diplomatic incidents, which was partially true. He stood up and took his cup with him. He put down the cup on the counter, where the cook was cleaning something, and walked towards the exit of the room. There he started his grand adventure to find Carlson. First he asked one of the guards outside of the cafeteria. They said they'd ring him, and that he should wait there for a few minutes. Tricurius took those precious minutes to ask the guards what he meant with ringing him, and although the guard wore a helmet, you could see his facial expression turned into one of exhaustion. Imagine you can talk to someone via a little device. If you ring someone, you're calling him via that device, speaking through that device to him. It reminded Tricurius of the Virillian speech, a spell which allowed you to use Ternitia to transfer your voice directly into someone's ear. It was thought up by Palexios Virillian. It was notoriously difficult to perform, however. As such devices common? Tricurius asked. The guard nodded. Yeah, they are. He paused for a moment. Practically everyone has them, although many of the devices with that function also serve multiple other purposes, he added. Interesting. To be able to record sounds like one can record letters must have many practical applications. Tricurius's mind raced through the various things you could do with such miraculous technology. Great scholars could record their words for all to hear. Information could be easily spread. That would explain the extraordinarily high level of education most humans seem to possess. I'd imagine such a thing would have many applications, Tricurius said. Before the conversation could progress any further, Carlson walked in. Inspecting his appearance, Tricurius noted black bags beneath his eyes and a rather tiresome look. Tricurius smiled. Greetings, Lieutenant, he said. Carlson tried to smile, but failed so miserably even an emotionally incompetent orc could see it. Greetings, Ambassador, he said with a meek voice. The man was doing worse than he had ever seen ever human do. Are you all right, Lieutenant? Tricurius asked. The lieutenant sighed. My job requires me to answer yes, he said. Enough pleasantries, though, he added. Tricurius nodded. Of course, apologies for bothering you, but I believe this request is quite urgent. He said, I wish to inquire about your culture, philosophy, and history, so that I might avoid diplomatic accidents like those that happened and will happen with the orcs, if that isn't too much of a problem. When he was finished pronouncing that last word, Carlson's face transformed from a rather sorrowful and tiresome expression to one much more energetic, although still far from happy. That isn't a problem in the slightest, on the contrary. It saves me a lot of time and energy. He raised his hand to his chin. Tell me, what do you want to know? That was a good question. What interested him most? He could start with their history, and although that would help a lot with explaining human cultural norms, religion, and philosophy, it most likely wouldn't help answer his question of what morality was, or who he was, or what was right and wrong in this world. Religion, although an incredibly important and often underestimated variable in diplomatic discussions, seemed to be largely irrelevant in human society. They did not pray to their gods, nor did he see humans arguing about them. Sometimes they referred to a god, so it was safe to assume if humans even worshipped gods at all, most of them were monotheistic. On the other hand, the Voron, although polytheistic, also cursed with the name of Astralike, and only Astralike. Making the assumption that the humans were monotheistic could be a grave error. Then, there was philosophy. What did the humans think? Not just of other things, but of themselves. Did they follow dwarven ethics and morals which decreed that there was no virtue but to be absolute in one's values? Or did they follow Questiar's idea that absolutism in and of itself wasn't a virtue, but absolutism of virtue was? And that virtue was simply dependent on who defined it, and as the gods, specifically the elven ones, were the most powerful, they defined what sin and virtue was. What to choose, what to pick. He was like a child with his parents at a market. Should he get the wooden castle or the dull sword? Should he pick religion or philosophy or maybe history? What about their culture and music? Those were also quite tempting options. What about literature and their scholars? All of it. That was Tricurius' answer to that seemingly impossible question. Truthfully speaking, that was an atrocious answer. Tricurius knew this, but he needed time to think. He was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of topics he could pick. This was a whole other world, with completely different ideas and history. Right, you know what, Ambassador, I've got an idea, Carlson said. Tricurius was all ears. This was a major opportunity, not just for the hypocritical institution that was the Imperium, but for himself as well. His own life wasn't just an extension of the Imperium, it was something in and of itself, and as such also held value in and of itself. I'll give you a brief summary of our history, some important philosophers, short summaries of our most important pieces of literature, and a summarized version of how human society works, and in exchange, you'll do the same for your world, Carlson proposed. That was a good deal. It would save the humans a bunch of time, most likely, but he wouldn't really be giving them any knowledge they couldn't get themselves. The things he got, however, it would take much more time, and he probably couldn't even get most of the knowledge he would receive. He nodded his head excitedly. Sounds like a good deal to me, Lieutenant Carlson, Tricurius said. Carlson smiled for a few seconds before returning to his normal, tired expression. Excellent. I'll be back within an hour or so, he said, before he hastily walked away. He'd have to ask one of his servants to fetch him his books about general history, mythology, and philosophy. That should provide the humans with a quite broad and satisfactory overview of Narivor and its peoples and its history. He then went to the room to do some more work and writing, and an hour later, he returned to the canteen. Carlson returned just a few minutes later. Following him was a massive human in a white cloth garment, pitch-black shoes, and loose blue trousers. He had medium-long blonde hair and green eyes as well as high and defined cheekbones. The man looked lean, and yet Tricurius could see the muscles through his shirt. The lieutenant smiled. He pointed his hand towards the massive man. This is Bjorn Sigurdsson. He's a historian and diplomat. Bjorn approached Tricurius and extended his hand. Salutations, Ambassador Tricurius. If I am correct? He asked. Tricurius decided to accept his greeting and shook his hand. Correct, Sir Sigurdsson. Bjorn will be educating and informing you about human practices, history, and culture. In exchange, we expect you to deliver either the information about your world in the form of books or by some teacher. Carlson said. Before Tricurius could utter another word, Carlson took a black rectangle. This is a tablet. It contains all the information humanity has ever gathered. He pointed towards Bjorn. He'll be with you to try and guide you how to use it. In wonder, Tricurius looked at the tablet as Carlson turned it on, and light shone out of it, almost like some divine power had touched it. Right. I'll get the documents to you within a few hours. I'll have some of my servants deliver some books to you, Tricurius said. Excellent, Carlson said. Then I suppose you'll be happy to know that if you wish you can begin right now, he said. Then let us start. He looked at Sigurdsson. Take a seat. This is going to take a while, Bjorn said as he pointed towards one of the tables at the canteen. Right. So I can look up anything? Tracurius said in disbelief. Bjorn nodded. Anything with a few exceptions. He said, though most of the things you're interested in will be there for you to see and read or watch. He scratched his chin. I already told you how videos worked, right? Tracurius nodded. You did. He said, how do tablets even work to begin with? Explaining that would take a long time, but we have time, so I could, Bjorn said. Bjorn was an interesting character in Tracurius's opinion. Perhaps the strongest man he'd ever met. The man could most likely bend steel with his bare hands, and yet he was also the most patient, calm, and positive person he'd met so far. I would prefer to try and look some things up on my own, Tracurius said to Bjorn, who merely smiled and nodded. If you need anything, ask any guard. I'll get you an earpiece soon, he said as he sat up and walked away. See you tomorrow, he said as he walked away. Tracurius took the tablet and started searching up any and all things that came to mind. First, he decided to delve into human history. He found a rather trustworthy site called Wikipedia. It had detailed and frankly ridiculous amounts of knowledge on it. According to the site, it began in what the humans called the Stone Age. Tracurius had already speculated that humans didn't have magic, but it was confirmed for him when he looked it up. He got no reliable sites to get information from, only fiction and literature. That implied that they once had magic, although that would be illogical as there wasn't any mention of it in the Stone Age article he had been looking at earlier, or that they didn't have magic. Of those two conclusions, he was more inclined to believe the latter one. Humans started out just as primitive as any other nation on Naravor. Tracurius noticed that a large part of the intricacies of human inventions had been left out, most likely so that he wouldn't be able to replicate them. Then humanity, or Homo sapiens, as was their scientific name, progressed to the next stage of development. The Bronze Age, it was an age of tremendous progress, and especially the cultures in the Bronze Ages fascinated Tracurius. He looked around and saw an increasing number of people entering the cafeteria. He checked the time on his watch, 17:58, almost dinner time. That explains it. He saw his entourage entering and sighed. They would want answers. The thing is, with elven politics, families, and even relationships, you could never be upfront and straight with anything. With maybe the exception of hate, that was expressed directly and honestly. Intentions, interests, hobbies, friendship, even love wasn't expressed up front. That would simply be embarrassing, or would it? If elven philosophy and society was wrong about so much, why wouldn't it be wrong about this either? Why was being upfront and honest wrong? It wasn't logical. Before Tracurius's mind could wander off any further, his knights alongside most of his servants came in. Verulius Nastrox, one of his scribes, approached him. Sir Tracurius, he said to grab his attention. Verulius, son of Canio and Octala of the noble house Nastrox, how are you? Tracurius smiled and waved him towards a chair. Verulius accepted his invitation and took a seat. I'm well, Sir Tracurius. I assume you are so as well? He asked. Yes, Verulius, I am. Tracurius said, What is it you wish to discuss? A son of such a noble and honest house as yours doesn't disturb others for no reason. Internally, Tracurius wanted to vomit at the words he just said. Verulius was the exact opposite of honest. He was a deceitful backstabber, ready to impale a knife into your back if you weren't watching it, both literally and metaphorically. Verulius smirked. Of course not, he said. He took a letter out of his pocket. Although I do have a letter for you from the despot of Kurarum, Neastos IV of House Iorum. He handed him the letter. Tracurius took it and opened it. To diplomat and illustrious sorcerer Tracurius. Salutations to you. I hope life finds you in good health, and I bid you greetings from the castle of Phalorum in the bountiful province of Kurarum. I have recently been informed that you seek to make peace, perhaps even trade with the inferior and despicable creatures that we have found to inhabit the land and world beyond ours. Indeed, this is regretful on many levels, so I come here with an ultimatum. Not really, more like a three-way choice. Either resign and I'll give you all the riches you could ever desire and a peaceful life, as a weakling like you would wish for. Ensure that there will be no peace with the humans and lead our armies on their way to crush them and take their land for me or die. May the gods guide your path, despot of Kurarum, Count of Uric, Baron of Phalorum, and Garstar and Duke of Iustor Neastos Thor Rurios Vultor of House Iorum. Trachurius looked up. Verulius met his gaze and smirked. He took a knife and pressed it against Trachurius's throat. As he pointed toward the exit of the cafeteria, "Let's take this to your quarters, or I'll slit your throat." Trachurius didn't know if he should be confused, threatened, or laughing. Although he chose the latter one, he channeled some Ternitia and forcefully used a magic hand to grab the knife and used the hand to curve the knife, after which he threw it against the table. "I don't know who's more idiotic, the despot or you," Trachurius as he continued chuckling like a maniac. "Even if wasn't an acclaimed sorcerer, you'd be facing a dozen guards armed with weapons beyond your comprehension," he said. Verulius took a step back, although he still had confident smirk on his face. "If I die, this place explodes," he said. He undid his coat, which revealed several runes all connected to the place his heart was supposed to be. "A mortality-triggered bomb," Trachurius said as looked at it. Verulius put his coat back on. "Now let's go to your room," he said, a smug smile on his face. Trachurius had no choice but to oblige. "Right," he said. Verulius stood up and started walking. Quickly, an idea entered Trachurius's head. He should notify at least somebody of what was going on. Verulius might have a bomb jacket on, but he couldn't actually sense Ternitia. Trachurius quickly focused his Ternitia into a telepathy spell and directed it to one of the guards. "I'm Trachurius, ambassador of the Imperium. I'm currently being held hostage by Verulius, a pawn of Despot Nyastos. If you kill him, a magical bomb will explode this place," he said. The guard heard it and quickly raised his rifle until he heard the last part. He pressed a few buttons on his helmet. Before Trachurius could see what happened after that, Verulius pushed him in the back. "Keep on walking. You'll get to say goodbye to your human lover later," he said as he let out a slight laugh. Trachurius shook his head and sighed as he kept on walking through the hallways to his room. When they eventually reached his room, Verulius sat him down on a chair. "Key," Verulius said as he extended his hand towards Trachurius. Trachurius reached into one of his pockets and gave Verulius the key. Why was he even complying? The magical vest was only triggered with his death. Before Trachurius could ponder that question further, Verulius grabbed a second knife and some rope. First he locked the door and then proceeded to tie Trachurius to the chair. He then walked out of the room for a moment. This was his opportunity. He tried to channel his Ternitia but failed miserably. He inspected the ropes a bit closer and saw that they dampened any Ternitia field. "Damn it," he said out loud. Verulius walked back in. "Your tricks won't work on me, slothful Upig." Trachurius threw his head back. "What do you want, criminal?" he asked Verulius. The tall elf revealed a piece of paper and an ink pen. "I want you to declare war on the humans, resign or die," he said. "I want you to seal a blood promise with me on one of those three things." A blood promise, that was a bit extreme. A blood promise meant that if he dared break his promise, he'd die. "You're a traitor to the Imperium and the Kaiser," Trachurius said. Verulius grinned. "Really? You're a traitor?" He said, "In 3 days, Despot Nyastos will seize the throne and restore the Imperium to its former glory." The tall man shouted at Trachurius. "His struggle to seize the throne is already almost complete," he said with burning conviction in his eyes. "He's staging a coup," Trachurius said in disbelief as he looked at Verulius. The criminal nodded. "In exactly 2 hours, the Caugusti will proclaim a new Kaiser, a new emperor, a new leader," he said with dedication. "You're a lunatic and a traitor. The people will see this new leader for who he is, a fraud and a criminal." Trachurius said, "This new leader will start a war with humanity, leading to deaths of millions and the eventual downfall of the Imperium." He said even louder, "We'd be lucky if even 1,000 elves survived this upcoming catastrophe. Oh, please. Since when does the ruthless and genocidal death of orcs have a problem with good elven ethics?" Verulius said. "I know of what you've done. You've sentenced hundreds to their deaths over mere meters of ground." Indeed, he did. He was the ambassador that failed to create a peace between the Orcish locals and Elven settlers. Then again, he tried to create a peace. He had good intentions. "At least I didn't sentence my entire race to their demise," he yelled back at Verulius. "I'm sentencing our race to greatness." Before Verulius could finish his sentence, he heard several kicks at the door. He walked towards Tricurius and put his knife to Tricurius's throat. A few kicks later, and the door was burst open. 3 relatively lightly armored guards appeared from the entrance. They wore pitch-black armor. At the end of their rifle was a knife, and their eyes were masked by a pair of glasses which were as black as the night. "Put the knife down!" one of them bellowed. This wasn't a normal voice, however. It was unnaturally deep, almost as harsh as metal. Tricurius glanced at Verulius. His determination was beginning to waver. He, however, pulled himself back together. "You take even a step forwards, and my knife will get blood on it," he said as he pressed the knife to my throat even tighter than before. Tricurius noticed something at the back of the room, however. A 4th soldier was carrying a grayish canister with an intimidating skull and bones on it. He opened it, but nothing came out. The guard that was previously screaming started speaking once more. "We'll give you 2 hours to give us the terms for his release," he said. "We'll most likely take another hour or so to consider them." Verulius nodded. "I see you can be reasonable, weakling," he said. "This traitor has to either kill himself, abandon his position as ambassador, or answer to the Kaiser once more." The soldier nodded. "We'll consider those terms. Give us a few hours," he said. Verulius laughed. "Right, but if I see that anything is amiss, I'll slit his throat," he bellowed out towards the guard. The guards then proceeded to leave, and Tricurius was left alone once more to his great dismay. The time seemed to fly by slowly. He was constantly thinking about either his inevitable demise or him being used as a puppet. Surely the humans had some plan, beyond leaving him here to die, of course. What about that canister? It had to contain something, right? The hours slowly passed, and yet Tricurius felt he was having difficulty breathing. It felt like the air he normally inhaled wasn't there. Instead, he was breathing in air which felt like water. Maybe it was just his nerves, though. He started getting headaches. They started to get more and more intense, until eventually he just wanted to sleep, and he did. He opened his eyes and heard several human guards screaming, "Get them out of there as quickly as possible! Make sure they get to inhale oxygen again!" they yelled. He was on a bed-like construction, being carried by 2 humans. Beside him, he could Verulius tied down to a similar contraption. He was saved, but how? Did Verulius also get put into a forceful sleep? He closed his eyes again. Nyastos sat there, mounted on a horse. His red hair swayed in the wind as his relatively small purple eyes looked out on the dozens of roads, farms, and guard towers in front of the Imperium's capital. He himself was clad in wonderfully decorated armor, with the insignia of the griffin etched into his breastplate. He was old, a grand 130 years old even. Behind him, thousands of men, some clad in the robes of a sorcerer, others clad in steel armor, with runes carved into their shield to protect them from magic. To the right, his leading commander, Cercilla, Baroness of Kolstadt, approached him. "Sire, the mangonels have been loaded with exploding projectiles," she informed him. He nodded. "Excellent. Has Verulius reported back in?" he asked. He honestly cared very little for Verulius, but he was a useful pawn to enact his plans. He would earn Ryman's gaze. He would earn his place as a god, as a true Kaiser, not one of the pretends that had plagued the Imperium for the past 1,000 years. "Make the sorcerers raise the ground so that our troops can get past the ditch with no issues. Then send walking corpses through the broken spots in the wall and make them absorb the first blows," he said as he turned his gaze towards the gate. "Once they think we are attacking through the walls, sent in the living statues, make them shatter the gate," he said. Cercilla nodded. "Understood, sire," she responded. "The enemy will most likely have stationed sorcerers and archers on the second set of walls." She said, "I doubt that our mangonels will be able to destroy them, considering the sorcerers will most likely form a magical barrier." The despot raised his hand to his chin. That is problematic. He said he should have expected this. He was trying to conquer the capital after all. Even after decades of corruption and mismanagement, it could still put up a fight. He, however, had one trick up his sleeve. The Imperium was reliant on its talented sorcerers, and he had managed to sway a vast majority of them. In front of the walls of the capital stood the largest force of sorcerers seen since the times of Ryman and the other legends. It had taken decades of planning, scheming, and convincing, but he had formed an enormous, albeit unstable alliance of the various colleges of magic. Frankly, it was surprisingly easy. The Imperium was corrupt and decadent. Its nobility only held their positions not due to their own actions and virtues, but due to their ancestors. It disgusted Nyastos to see a nation of nobility and virtue being destroyed from the inside, to see commoners being pushed aside despite their qualities, despite their merit. He wanted to reform this corrupted mess. The Imperium was no longer Ryman's dream. It was his nightmare. He had a vision, a dream, a goal. That goal was simple. He wished to reform the Imperium to ensure that those who were competent, those who possessed the qualities that were required of a good leader, lead. A system wherein a person's lot in life is dependent on their parents, on their birth, is a system that is bound to fail. He would show the world that. A smile graced his lips. The actions he was currently conducting were virtuous, divinely ordained, and would lead to a brighter future. One where elvenkind rules supreme, one where the faithful, the ruthless, and the ambitious hold the power over the decadent, weak, and merciful, not the other way around. His mind snapped back to Cersilla that looked at him with a questioning gaze. Then he got an idea. The sorcerers who will put up this shield, they are unlikely to expect an attack from below, yes? He asked the commander. She nodded. Yes, sire. Silence reigned for a few seconds until she put her hand up. You wish for our earth mages to collapse the walls from below? She asked. Nyastos nodded. Indeed, he said. We have the largest force of sorcerers ever assembled. We might as well make use of them. Rhymstadt never faced an attacker with more than a few druids. It is well protected against a conventional assault. A magical one has better odds, he said. That isn't a bad idea. I'll inform the Grand Inquisitors of the magical colleges, she said as she spurred her horse and rode off to the Grand Inquisitor's tents. Before Nyastos could plan anything beyond his current plans, a messenger came riding up to him. The man looked exhausted and completely out of breath. Nyastos focused on the man. He saw bloodstains on his right arm. He, however, saw no arrow. It couldn't have been a sword cut either. Perhaps a fireball. The area did look like it was burned. The arm itself was only hanging on by a thread. Sire, despot, he said as he dismounted and collapsed onto the ground. Before the man could continue any further, Nyastos knelt down onto his level and handed him a pouch of water. You did your duty despite your injuries. You proved your courage, bravery, and strength of character, he said. He gestured towards his personal surgeon and healing sorcerer, who immediately attended to the scout. Most men would have surrendered to death, you didn't. That is virtuous in the eyes of the gods, he said. He stood back up. Now tell me, you come from Gruntharn. You bring news from Verulius, yes? He asked the man. He made sure to speak loudly. This was an excellent opportunity to raise morale, to increase his reputation as a stout leader who cared for those in his service, to show the world that merit was to be rewarded. Yes, sire, I do, he said, as he knelt down in front of Nyastos. Verulius, he has been captured by the humans. They are currently holding him captive, he said between gasps of air. Tracurius still lives. The humans managed to somehow bypass the magical harness. A frown appeared on Nyastos's face. Then it appears that these humans are more capable than I expected, he said out loud. Anything else? He asked. The scout nodded. Verulius managed to hand me Tracurius's research papers on the humans. He told me to give it you. The scout quickly handed with his one good arm, which was still shaking, Nyastos a tattered, although still intact, journal. How did you manage to get yourself injured to such a degree? The humans only possess excellent heavy infantry. I was informed of that, he asked the scout. Their infantry. They're armed with magic that isn't magic, sire, he said, still panting. Perhaps the journal will explain it further, sire, he said. Neastos nodded and grabbed 2 bronze revens and handed them to the scout. Buy yourself some drinks, he said as the scout hastily removed himself from his presence. The despot took the journal. He gestured towards his guards. Set up a tent, chair and desk for me. I wish to study this journal here. Of course, sire, the guard said as he hastily sped off to get a chair, tent, and desk. He might have underestimated the humans severely. These weren't just some mindless brutes incapable of science, magic, and the arts. If they could make magicless magic, it could mean 3 things. Either a deity, a god, or some other divine being granted them this ability, which was unlikely considering the humans displayed little to no religious zeal. They managed to discover a new form of magic. Although unlikely it wasn't impossible, his sorcerers hadn't detected any ternitia around humans. It could, however, be that they figured out a way to utilize another magical energy. The last solution to this rather perplexing question would be that their conventional means of observing and influencing the world were sufficient to pass as magic. That was perhaps the most dangerous answer of the 3. That would mean that besides weapons, magic, and armor, they understood the forces which made the world as it is. And if one understands something, it becomes 1,000 times easier to change it. In any case, he had matters to attend to. Verulius was dead. The humans would see the attempted assassination of Tricurius as a provocation, and most likely launch an assault or be hostile towards his new imperium. If he had done more thorough research, and not just made assumptions based on a limited amount of information, that wouldn't have been a problem. He had, however, made his attack under the assumption that the humans were a force he could defeat with ease, and that provoking them into attacking him was to lead to a glorious victory. He could still salvage the situation, however, he needed to blame somebody. He could say that a criminal lord or a power-hungry usurper had claimed to be him, that he had been framed. He could also say that this power-hungry usurper was the current Keyser, that could maybe even earn the favor of the humans. Indeed, he just needed to give the current Keyser a motive. He needed to plant evidence of his guilt. That, however, wouldn't be a problem indeed. Within a few days, he would be inside the imperial palace, if everything went well, at least. Still, he needed a backup plan. He couldn't let all his plans be ruined by an utterly random and unpredictable third party. He turned towards one of his guards. Call Gurdian. I need to speak with him. The guard nodded and ran off to get the man. In the meantime, his chair, table, and tent had been set up and ready. 2 men, both clad in richly decorated heavy armor, guarded the tent. His personal guard. He entered the tent, placed the journal on the table, and sat down on the chair. He needed to have a chat with his spymaster about the current events. The sword and the hammer weren't tools to solve the human issue anymore. A pen and knife would have much better results. Tricurius's eyes opened as he started to regain consciousness. He took in the world surrounding him. He was in a white room. The light, it was intense. The world looked so foggy and vague. He tried to focus on something and partially succeeded. There was a human, in a white coat. He laid his head back on the pillow. He just now noticed he was in a bed. What had happened? The last memory he could still recall he was being carried out of a room his kidnapper, Verulius, had captured him in. How did the humans knock both of them unconscious? Perhaps they manipulated the very air. That would be both frightening and enticing. If such a thing were possible, it could lead to so many things. Ambassador Tricurius, the human in the white coat said, I'm Dr. Naomi Nowak. You might feel a bit dizzy. It will pass within 10 minutes or so, she said. Right, the elven ambassador said as he tried to straighten himself. Where's Verulius? What happened, doctor? She asked the woman. How do I put this? She said as he contemplated her words. We altered the air so that you were knocked unconscious. Verulius is currently being held in a high-security cell, she said. The implications of this accident could ruin his career and reputation, his very livelihood. Despot Neastos was trying to usurp the throne, and considering how very flawed the Imperium was, it wouldn't surprise Tricurius if he would succeed. Usurping the title of Keyser would involve successfully besieging Reimstadt, however. Whatever Neastos's intentions were, in Tricurius's eyes, He was power-hungry lunatic. His aggressive policies would surely spell the downfall of the Imperium, and what would succeed it? Chaos and death, thousands of counts, despots and dukes fighting each other to restore the Imperium or to expand their own domain. When you're feeling well, I'd advise you to eat meal, drink some water, bathe, and talk to Ambassador Patricia. She said she wished to speak with you, the doctor said as she walked out of the room. If there's something wrong, just say it. Tracurius nodded as the doctor exited the room. He got up and, although it was difficult, managed to get out of the bed he had been placed in. His clothes were still on, although he would probably have to change them eventually. It would do for the upcoming 20 minutes. He exited the room. The room his bed was in had 2 guards guarding the door. He went to his own private quarters. When he arrived, he took a shower and put on a different set of clothes. Then he went to the cafeteria, eager to eat something. He ordered some bread alongside, something humans called bacon and eggs. He drank plain water. After he was finished eating his meal, he called his 2 knights to accompany him to the human ambassador. He wondered what this was about. Well, he knew what it was about. The attempt to kill him, of course. He just pondered what the ULE would do about it. Would they intervene? Would they attempt to reconcile with Neastos? Would they try to kill Neastos? Who knows? When Tracurius arrived at the ambassador's office, he was surprised to find Carlson standing in front of it, with 2 guards accompanying him. Ambassador Tracurius, please follow me, he said as he gestured towards the right hallway. Tracurius nodded his and complied. They walked through a dozen hallways until they reached a particularly large hall. In the center of the hall was a large chair with an elevated desk. Surrounding the desk there were a dozen or so benches. The walls were decorated with stained glass. The stained glass was portraying globes, rotating around a large yellow object, and in particular a green with blue globe. Around the hall were several large banners. One of them was a globe surrounded by a crown of leaves. The globe in particular was completely gold, with the exception of strange shapes which were white. Another one of the banners was red. In the center, there was a rocky globe, which was completely white. Yet another one of the flags was a yellow star surrounded by several other yellow stars on a completely red banner. Indeed, the variety in these banners was staggering, and yet each one of them was most likely made by masterful artisans, as they looked magnificent. The floor itself was made out of brown tiles, each one masterfully inserted and unstained. On the ceiling of the hall, there hung several lamps, each one of them decorated with silver and gold. Creating such wonders must cost a fortune. "Good afternoon, Ambassador Tracurius," a female voice rang out, the human ambassador. Tracurius composed himself. "Salutations, Ambassador," he said. "My apologies for the rather meager hall. We had to build it in a few days," Patricia said, as she gestured towards a chair in front opposite of her own. "Take a seat, Ambassador," she said. Tracurius desperately tried to not look impressed. If this was considered meager, what was considered majestic? A hall such as this one could rival the imperial throne room. That was a truly impressive feat. And this was built in just a few days, if the ambassador was to be believed. "I've heard about the attempt on your life. I must apologize for letting such a thing happen in the first place," the human ambassador said. Tracurius raised his hands. "The blame isn't yours," he said. "Imperial authorities will arrest the man responsible for this." He doubted that himself. The current imperial government was under siege. It was quite unlikely they'd spent their precious forces to try and save some mostly unimportant ambassador. "About that," the woman said. "Are you familiar with Despot Neastos IV of Kararum?" she asked him. Tracurius should have expected they would want to get involved. Then again, why wouldn't he let them get involved? Let the humans do the dirty work and ensure that the old Kaiser once again rules over the Imperium, morally questionable? Sure, the current Kaiser was corrupt and a fool, but still better than the chaos and unrest that would follow if Neastos usurped the throne. "Unfortunately, I am," Tracurius said. "Then you'll be aware that he's currently besieging your capital?" the human ambassador asked. "Yes, not that the capital being under siege is a rare occurrence." Tracurius said, "Civil wars and wars of succession aren't uncommon in the slightest. The thing is, Reimstadt, the capital can resist nearly every conventional military assault. Patricia said. You're also aware that he has gathered a significant force of sorcerers? She said. How well is Reimstadt defended against a magical assault? She asked. Depends, define a large force, for me, Tricurius asked. Several thousands, almost every single one of your colleges, she said. Well, Reimstadt was going to fall within a few days if that was the case. Neastos was overly ambitious and reckless, but he wasn't an idiot. When Tricurius did work for the despot, he found that he was quite competent and shrewd. Not just that, but he had an eye for talent. That last trait, however, could also spell his eventual defeat. He refused to listen to priests or listen to his betters. It was tragic. Then again, were the priest and his betters truly better? The last couple weeks had forced Tricurius to change his outlook not just on the Imperium, but to life in general. Regardless of his moral purity, he would still usher in an age of chaos when his overly aggressive ideas would inevitably lead to his downfall, and he'd take the Imperium with him. Then I doubt that Reimstadt will last for more than a few days, to be completely frank, Tricurius said. Reimstadt wasn't built to resist a magical assault. It was meant to last against millions of footmen and archers, not sorcerers. Patricia let out an exasperated sigh. Then the Imperium will fall, she said. There's also a chance Neastos was framed, she said. Although that last one has to be confirmed before Neastos can be considered innocent or guilty. If Neastos is guilty, what will you do? Tricurius asked. Well, that's why I asked you to come, she said. We cannot support the current Kaiser Eufulius. Even if we would secure his position, he'd face constant revolts and would most likely continue mismanaging the Imperium. She said, supporting Neastos, even if he has tried to negotiate with us, would be risky. How so? Tricurius asked. If he manages to usurp the throne, he'll most likely be revered by the colleges of magic, and with his skill for intrigue, it is unlikely he would fail to appease the nobility. Perhaps the chance he's lying about being framed isn't small, however, she said. Besides, it would mean declaring war on the majority of Naravor, which is exactly what we're trying to avoid. So who are you going to support, then? Tricurius asked. That's where you come in, she said. Do you know of anyone else with a strong claim on the throne? She asked. Tricurius scratched his chin. I do, he said. However, I need to get some in return. Information is more valuable than any currency, after all. What do you wish for? Patricia asked. I wish to apply for residence within ULE-controlled territory. Tricurius said, If Neastos usurps the throne, there's a large chance I'll get caught in some unfortunate accident leading to my death, Tricurius said. Patricia nodded. All right, I agree, she said. I'll hand you the paperwork after you give me the information. There's two people. Tricurius said, First, there's the bastard of the father of the current Kaiser. He said, Gupian is his name, although I'd advise against putting him on the throne if you wish for peace. Why exactly, if I may ask? Patricia asked. Gupian is a Templar, which is as violent a profession as it sounds. Tricurius said, They hunt monsters, enemies of the Imperium, and their whole ethos is based around Ryman, and Ryman's whole thing is conquest and glory. So, who's the second candidate? Patricia asked. That would be Sarnatian the Elder, Tricurius said in a matter-of-fact tone. He's the uncle of Gapian and the current Kaiser. He's currently living in exile somewhere in Valand. Valand? Patricia asked. It's the home of the orcs. He's currently the arbiter of the Falkund village. Tricurius. I was ordered to spy on him on the orders of Neastos. The sun was setting on the Falkund village. Eimil was standing watch at the arbiter's hut. It was a long day. Forces of the High King had once again demanded tribute from the village. The problem with this demand was that they had nothing to give. Rogue Imperial troops had sacked their village recently. Dozens died, and most of the houses were burnt to the ground. To add on to their list of problems, their warehouse was sacked, and the grain taken. It was disastrous. The Druids abandoned them in their time of need. Their reasoning was that this was a mere culling of the weak. Eimil could feel his hands freezing. The winter was nearing, and they were completely out of supplies. He tightly clenched his spear. The druids refused to assist them with enchanting their weapons, too. The Arbiter was the only shred of hope they had left. He was the man which held the power to enchant arms within his grasp. But a single man can only do so much. The Arbiter needed time to rest, time the village didn't have. If the High King would act and seize their last belongings, some might even be sold into slavery to pay the tribute to the king. They got protection from nothing, and in exchange they sold their entire lives to this pathetic monarch. Anger swelled in Emil's heart, and yet there was nothing he could do. He hadn't eaten in a week, sleep too was hard to come by. And yet there were 100 or so souls which depended on him. He couldn't falter, not now, not ever. Emil once again opened his eyes and spotted something. 5 silhouettes were approaching. Were these the High King's men? The 5 figures continued encroaching into the village. Emil heard his captain scream, "Everyone, form a spear line at the gate!" The man yelled, "Everyone who is on guard, notify the person you're guarding and rush to the spear line." There was a chorus of, "Yes, Captain," and the men quickly got into position. Emil, too, quickly moved to notify the Arbiter. First, he knocked on the door of the hut. "Yes, what's happening?" the Arbiter yelled back. "Come in," he added. Emil did as the Arbiter suggested and entered. "Sire, 5 people are encroaching. They may be a scouting party for the High King's forces." Emil informed him. "I need to aid the defense of the gate," he said. Nobody had ever seen the Arbiter's face, and yet it was a well-known fact that he was a talented magician and enchanter. "Very well, I'll come with you," he said. Emil looked confused. "I'm a sorcerer, remember?" "Right, sire," Emil said as they quickly rushed to the gate. "State your intentions!" the captain yelled at the figures. The silhouettes were quickly approaching. The closer they came, the more the ground quaked, the larger they seemed. After a few more minutes of this agonizing waiting, they came to a halt. "We're here to meet with Narration the Elder," one of them said in fluent Orcish. The Arbiter took a step forward. The captain tried to stop him, but was pushed to the side. "So my time has finally come," the Arbiter said. "We simply wish to have a peaceful discussion. Perhaps we could even come to an agreement," the invader said. "If only everyone had that attitude," the Arbiter commented. "Very well. Take 2 of your soldiers with you. I will also take 2 of my soldiers with me. We'll meet halfway between me and you," the man said as he pointed to the middle of the 2. The captain raised his hands. "Sire, you can't possibly do this. This could be a trap. You're our last beacon of hope. We can't afford to lose you," he protested. The Arbiter remained calm. "Everything in our lives comes with a certain degree of risk, so call me selfish and reckless. But I think this is a risk worth taking," he said. "If you want to help, let 2 of your finest soldiers accompany me." The captain reluctantly nodded. "Fine. Emil and Velini accompany him," he yelled. "Yes, Captain," the 2 said in unison. The 3 started marching. The ground was wet, as always. If you went off the main road, you'd most likely sink into a bed of mud and water. Valand was a swampy province, where there was perpetual rainfall and an abundance of poisonous animals. The 100 or so meters they had to walk felt like a million. With each step, the tension in the air became stronger and more palpable. Then there were the loud footsteps of their possible foes. It felt like a giant was walking across these grounds. Each time one of those behemoths took a step, it was like thunder was raining down upon the earth. Even though the light was dim due to the sun going down and the clouds above him, he could still make out that these were massive pillars of iron and steel. Their eyes, however, had a slight glow to them, and yet the Arbiter was calm, even content with whatever might befall him. He hid his face behind a mask, but Emil was certain that under that layer of bronze and iron, he was fine with all of this, unfazed with his possible death. Just a few steps left, that was what Emil was thinking as they neared the meeting point. The thundering footsteps of the giants finally stopped as they reached the meeting point. "Salutations, Sir Narration," the Goliath said as it took off its helmet, revealing a face similar to an elf in complexion, yet slightly darker. "I'm Major Darius Gamal," he said with a this time gentler voice. Maybe it was due to that Emil could now see that this was a person, or perhaps it was because the helmet was removed, but the man's voice became a lot more soothing and less coarse. The man had wavy, short hair which was a shade of black. His eyes were a darker shade of brown. His cheekbones were defined and rather high. He also possessed a much more defined and rigid facial structure than most elves. His ears weren't pointed either, and yet he was too tall to be a dwarf and not green enough to be an orc. Which race did this man belong to was a question which continued to irk Imel as he continued to observe the man. Maybe a half-elf. Even then, the suit of armor he wore was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was made by a truly exceptional craftsman. You couldn't observe any stain on it. "Greetings to you, Major," the Arbiter said. "Why are you here?" He proceeded to inquire. "Simple," Darius said. "We wish to install you on the throne of the Imperium." That was everything except simple. But why the Arbiter? He wasn't even an elf, let alone an elf with a claim on the Imperial throne. So why was this strange man making such an outrageous demand? Before either Darius or the Arbiter could say something, the Arbiter removed his mask. To the guards' shock, they didn't see an orc or Amoni. They saw a pure-blooded elf. The Arbiter looked no older than 30. Elves couldn't grow beards, and so he didn't have one. He had a pointy chin and bright purple eyes. He had medium-length blonde hair and a bleak, completely white complexion. "I don't desire more responsibility than I already possess," he said. "I don't desire an empire, I merely desire a peaceful and just life." Darius sighed. "That is a noble goal," he said. "And yet, by refusing to take responsibility, you doom millions to lead brutish, short, and miserable lives. I'm done with imperial politics. They're tiring and pointless." The Arbiter said, "So I refuse," he said as he put his mask back on and turned around. "Have a nice evening," he said as he walked away. "Then tell me, is there anything you desire?" Darius asked. The Arbiter turned around to meet Darius's gaze. "I've already told you what I desire," he said. "Actually." He stopped and walked back to the armored man. "There's one more thing I wish for." The Arbiter said, "If you somehow manage to grant this village peace and safety, as well as a guarded warehouse with enough supplies to last it through the upcoming year, I'll consider you offer." "Deal," Darius said. The Arbiter once again removed his mask and raised his eyebrow. "I'm asking quite a bit of you," he said. "Are you sure you'll be able to do that?" "I'll have it done within 3 days." The Major said, "I promise you that." "Very well. Then I suppose I'll also need to uphold my end of the bargain." The Arbiter said, "So tell me, how do you plan on usurping the throne?" he said as a small smirk graced his face. Sarnation looked on in awe as dozens of human machines were constructing a formidable wall around their village. The humans, as they called themselves, had already replenished a year's worth of food in their warehouse and completely restored it to its former glory. On top of all of that, they had also supplied the militia with brand new armor and weapons. How they managed to get all of that to the admittedly quite isolated village was a great unknown to the former Arbiter. "It is time to leave," Darius said as he placed his hand on the former Arbiter's shoulder. Sarnation nodded. "I suppose it is," he said to Darius. "Off to usurp the Imperium's throne," he said with a humorous tone. "Sir, we'll start moving whenever you give the signal," one of Darius's lackeys said. Darius acknowledged him with a nod. "Right," he said. He turned to Sarnation with a faint smile. "Let's start." Sarnation nodded. "Let us." A few hours later, they were still walking across the muddy path that was considered a road. The swamps and bogs of Valand were filled to the brim with dangerous creatures. Making any journey here was perilous. You could get eaten by a black wolf or torn apart by a pack of ghouls at any point. The journey was awkward, to say at the very least. In an attempt to relieve some of that awkwardness, Sarnation decided to start a conservation. "So, how do you like Valand?" he asked the human. The human thought about the question for a few moments before giving a response. "Could be worse. A bit gray, though," he answered. "Nothing like the deserts that were my home." Deserts? The realm of the humans was truly fascinating in that case. Large heaps of sand. That was what his books described deserts as. Sarnation was always intrigued by the foreign and unknown. "How do you come by water?" Sarnation asked. I heard deserts were pretty dry. They are mostly, Darius answered as he kept walking at a fast pace. There are, however, wells dotted around them. That was worth investigating. The only desert Naravor had was to the south of the Imperium. The only creatures that inhabited these lands beyond the jungles of Kulanong were the Arismer, a race of beast folk, lived. They were described as massive, centaur-like people, with great strength and a hulking frame. Their fur was dense and almost impossible to get through with any weapon. They wielded massive hammers made for war with two front limbs. I assume you aren't from around here either? Darius asked Sarnation. Sarnation nodded. I'm from the metropolis of Reimstadt, one busy with trade and with corruption, he said. If you don't mind me asking, why were you exiled? Darius asked the elf, who, upon hearing that question, looked somberly out at the swamp they were traversing. All you need to know is that I was always the failed son, and the moment I noticed the problems with the Imperium, I was to be silenced, so I fled, he said with a hint of sadness. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked, Darius said as he empathized with the elf. No matter, he responded. If I didn't want you to know, I wouldn't have told you. After he finished his sentence, he heard a twig snap. Not due to him stepping on it, no, this was something else. Did you hear that as well? Darius asked. Sarnation nodded. I'll cast a detection spell, he said as he focused his Turnesia and combined it together. Unlike a fireball or a bolt of lightning, which only needed to be mentally molded, a proper spell needed to be casted. Casting required quite a bit of stuff. For one, a focusing object was required. In his case, it was his amulet, a Valtorn kin. Valtorn kins were truths of the universe etched into a physical vessel. These truths were universal laws, always to be obeyed by everyone and everything. While you could cast spells without a focusing object, it was difficult and required rigorous practice. Maybe only a few sorcerers in the Imperium could pull it off, and they all were in service of the Keyser. Some sorcerers used gallicans, weapons with the same properties as Valtorn keens, but trading intensity for endurance. Many other focusing objects exist. Even books, when properly enchanted, can serve as them. Casting proper spells required one, because it wasn't just dispelling Turnesia and transforming it into energy. It was completely restructuring it, forming bolts, fireballs, draining and giving Turnesia, however, didn't require one. It required a caster which was capable of bearing the anguish of subjecting your mind to a universal truth. Luckily, however, it only gets easier from your first time. Wo et farno levitis dal tervo, et revel don position, Sarnation said as he channeled his Turnesia into the focusing object. As he commanded, water and fire arose and created a fire above the heads of every living being around them. Heat scans indicate 30 beings, one of the humans said, which was confirmed by Sarnation's spell, as 30 flames arose from the forest. The 3 people ran out. Ghouls! Sarnation yelled as he pointed to them. Before Sarnation could channel Turnesia, he was knocked down onto the ground by one of the ghouls. Well, this was the end. That was the thought that raced through his mind. He closed his eyes, ready to die. He then heard a loud boom. He opened his eyes. His assailant's head was completely melted off into hot goo. He pushed the ghoul off him. In front of him was another ghoul, another loud bang, another melted head. 28 to go, he thought, as he channeled some Turnesia. He shaped it into a fireball and let loose. 3 ghouls were burned to a crisp, which bought Sarnation time to fall back. Get to the back! One of the humans said, as they were seemingly preparing something. Sarnation nodded and ran to the back. A few moments later, and the soldier let out a massive wave of fire. It wasn't magical, however. The ghouls screamed in anguish as they were burned alive. The little skin on their bones was completely burned as their hideous 3-eyed faces hit the ground. That had killed off the majority. The few ghouls left scurried away. The humans, however, didn't relent. More loud bangs filled the air as more ghouls screamed in pain. They weren't hunting the humans. The humans were hunting them. All of a sudden, however, the ghouls stopped running. It was like they saw something more dangerous in the direction they were going, screaming in fear, pain, and confusion as they ran towards the humans who were mowing them down without any effort. A few moments later, and all the ghouls lay dead. Then, however, they started hearing stomps. "Sarnation, do you have any idea what is happening?" Darius asked as he turned towards the elf. "An undead giant, perhaps," the elf said. "They're giants who turned into ghouls, extremely dangerous. Even regular ghouls are afraid of them," he said. "Just what I needed," Darius said as he braced himself. "You know anything else about them?" he asked. "I can tell you how corpses turn into ghouls, but that wouldn't do you much good," Sarnation said as he lifted his hand to his chin. "They're undead creatures. Just cutting off their arms and legs won't work. Punching a hole through their heart won't work either. You either have to set them ablaze or decapitate them," he said. "That's something at least, thanks." Darius said, "Smith Lynn, I want you to try and distract it. Carter try to explode it somehow." The human ordered his lackeys. The soldiers nodded and a chorus of "yes, sirs" erupted. A few minutes later and the giant had neared them. It was the height of all the trees surrounding them. It neared 30 meters. Its face had 13 eyes. Each one of those were focused on the group of humans and the elf. It had loose flesh hanging off its cheekbones. It had a ghastly and nightmare-inducing appearance. Its body was even worse. Its intestines were exposed for all to see. The left side of its pectoral muscle was torn off, revealing its somehow still working organs. The right side of its pectoral muscle had its skin torn off. At the end of each of its arms was a clawed hand. Underneath its claws, you could clearly see the blood of the many creatures it had already killed. The giant let out a monstrous laugh as it neared the group of humans, who steeled themselves. The humans started blasting it with everything they had. Chunks of bone, organ, and skin flew out the giant. It, however, didn't stop. Carter, the soldier ordered to explode it, was doing something, however. Bang after bang rang out, and yet the giant did not halt its approach. It continued to stomp towards the armored retinue. It neared one of the soldiers who tried making a run for it, and yet failed miserably. Sarnation looked on as the giant gripped the human in its massive hand. Unable to simply stand by and watch, he devised a plan. With everything he had left, he conjured up a massive blade. He focused on his amulet. "Ispirit tan que ferrum levitis," he chanted as he collapsed onto the ground. From the earth arose a gargantuan fiery blade, a great 2 meters in length and broad in diameter too. With the last bits of his strength, Sarnation lifted his hand upwards, using telepathy to raise the blade through the giant's arm. It screamed its pain as its hand fell off. Sarnation focused. "Now to decapitate the beast," he said as he raised his hand once more and aligned it. Before he, however, had the chance to take its head, a missile flew through the air right to the giant's head. It exploded on impact, leaving a massive hole where the giant's face once was. With no mouth left to scream with, the giant ghoul collapsed onto the ground, as did Sarnation, completely spent. Sarnation woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the smell of a campfire entering his nostrils. He opened his eyes. He laid beside a campfire. The humans gathered around that same campfire. He got upright. He noticed a large cut on his forearm, which had already been bandaged. He didn't even notice when he was fighting the ghouls. "Good morning," he said, as he tried to take in the scene with his still blurry vision. "Ah, you're awake," one of the humans said. "Want some bread? Maybe some water?" he proceeded to ask. "Sounds good," Sarnation answered. The human handed him a piece of bread and a canteen full of water. Sarnation took a sip and then a bite of the loaf of bread. "You saved me there, you know," the human said. "I guess, although survival instincts alone were enough to motivate me." Sarnation responded as he took another sip out of the canteen. "Still, I just wanted to thank you," the human said. "You're welcome, I guess," Sarnation said as he took another bite of the loaf of bread. The human took off his helmet to reveal a pale man with green-colored eyes and fiery red hair. "I owe you a favor. If you ever want to call on it, just tell me. Name's Daniel Smith," he told the elf. "I'll remember, Daniel," Sarnation said as he looked the human in the eyes. "If you two are done bonding, we can resume our march." Darius approached, followed by the remaining 2 human soldiers. "Right. Will you allow me to get put on something more appropriate?" Sarnation asked Darius, who nodded in response. After putting on his gambeson, boots, cloak, amulet, and changing his socks, the elf was ready to go. "How long until we arrive?" Sarnation asked the humans. "Another 5 or so hours until we reach camp. There we can get out of this godforsaken swamp," Darius answered. "Hopefully we won't be attacked by ghouls again." "It was unusual," Sarnation said in response. "What was?" Darius asked. "The ghouls, they usually prey on the sick, dead, and dying. It's how to procreate," Sarnation answered. "How do ghouls procreate?" Darius asked in return. "Undead procreate by taking corpses with Ternetia in them and putting them in cursed or magical grounds," Sarnation answered. "Though there are varieties, burned are usually mages who are burned, as the name might imply." "Any other kinds?" Darius asked. "Well, you have drowned, which are corpses who have drowned in magical waters, bloodsuckers who are exceptional mages that underwent the ghoulification process," Sarnation explained. "And a lot more. Frankly, I'm surprised. You appear to be a knowledgeable man, and yet you lack knowledge of the Magvi and Bogvi. So why do you think they attacked us?" Darius asked Sarnation. "If only I could answer that question for that." Sarnation said, "Even the most predictable Magvi have cases that form an exception, and ghouls are all but the most predictable Magvi," he answered. "What you're saying is that we don't know," Darius said somberly, "and that this could happen again." "That's one way to interpret it, yes," Sarnation answered. "If we had more time, we could use the intestines of an animal and a few herbs to make distractions for the ghouls. Throw them off. Sadly, we don't have that time." Sarnation said, "Moving fast is the best solution to the predicament we're currently in." "Sounds like a plan at the very least," Darius said as he increased the pace. "Still curious as to why we don't just get a truck or a helicopters or something like that." One of the soldiers said, "Not Daniel." No, it was a notably more feminine voice, although that was difficult to tell through the filter the human's helmet applied. "You notice the landscape we're in. Any truck would get stuck in the mud." The other human soldier responded. This one had a coarse, harsh voice. "Doesn't rule out helicopters," the feminine voice said one more. "Pretty sure the diplomats fucked up and the High King denied us passage through his lands. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to be arrested and then executed," the coarse voice said back. "Still better than them finding our corpses being eaten by undead," the feminine voice snapped back. "And worse than escaping unseen and unharmed," the coarse voice argued back. "Quit arguing and start marching faster," Darius yelled out. Approximately 5 hours later, Sarnation eyes scanned the human camp. There were dozens of humans everywhere doing dozens of tasks. Each and every one of was unlike the average peasant, however. Most of them were literate, even stranger. They all seemed strangely young, well-fed, and none of them were ill. Most armies, when on march, were malnourished and sick, with the exception of knights, men-at-arms, and sorcerers. But those were the exception, not the rule. "Done staring?" Darius asked. "Think so," Sarnation said. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Since we're officially out of Orcish territory, a helicopter is coming to pick us up," Darius responded. "You never explained to me what a helicopter is," Sarnation said. Then he heard a loud wind-like sound surround him. Sarnation was startled by the noise and looked up to look at the thing causing the sound. "I assume that's a helicopter?" he asked. Darius nodded. "That would be a good assumption," he responded. "You sure that's safe?" Sarnation asked back. "Safer than going by foot, I can tell you that much," Darius answered. "I guess I've got no choice but to believe you," Sarnation said as the helico in a designated area. The noise stopped. Darius and his squad approached the helicopter. Sarnation meekly followed. "Strap yourself in," Darius said as he entered the vehicle and strapped himself in. Sarnation looked at the straps in confusion. He looked at the others and copied what they were doing. One of the soldiers noticed this and aided him in strapping himself down. "So where are we heading?" Sarnation asked. "Gruntharn," Darius responded. "The Ammonic Castle?" Sarnation looked at the human in confusion. "The Ammonic Castle, yes," he responded. "Interesting. You managed to conquer the Ammoni?" Sarnation asked. "I apologize for my ignorance. I've been away for far too long." "Not exactly," Darius responded. "Somehow a massive portal opened between this continent and my own continent. We're not some otherworldly invasion force. That was what the world of Narravor would know as the truth. After all, much of their world was still unknown. Magic, although powerful, was rare and was only taught to the elite. "So how did you come to possess Gruntharn?" Sarnatian asked. "Well, after the portal opened in front of the dwarven fortress of Halamund, we first sent a scouting force and then a small diplomatic envoy," Darius said. "The fortress of Halamund? The same fortress which is manned by fanatics so zealous they kill everything in a 500-meter radius of it?" Sarnatian said in disbelief. "If only we had that knowledge at that time. 2 of our diplomats were killed before we could evacuate," Darius explained. "And then what?" Sarnatian asked. "We took Halamund in one night, after which we invited emissaries from all nations. The Imperium still didn't see us as an actual nation. The orcs were too busy killing each other because another one of their civil wars was going on. I don't think any nation south to the Imperium even got the invitations, and the Amani were the only ones that actually showed up," Darius said. Sarnatian's eyes grew larger while hearing that. The fortress of Halamund taken within a single night? If he hadn't witnessed what the humans had been capable of during their little battle with the ghouls, he wouldn't have believed the man. On the topic of human capabilities, the elf still didn't understand how any of this was possible. He was hundreds of meters up in the air, in a vehicle without any magic powering it. Had these humans managed to decipher the laws of nature without the help of the divine, infernal, or magical? That couldn't possibly be. "What happened to the dwarves? Did they try to destroy you? They tend to do that to invaders," Sarnatian asked, still in shock of how easily the seemingly impregnable fortress was taken. "They just ignored us. I think they were intimidated." Darius said, "I digress. The Emani offered us the castle of Gruntharn as a permanent embassy. In exchange, we would set up a trade network with them and try to preserve the shaky peace between them and the Imperium." "A deal with devils," Sarnatian said. "I don't actually think they are that bad." Darius said, "They may have a bit of an obsession with animal sacrifices, blood magic and raiding, but truth be told, so do the orcs, as do the Imperium, the dwarves, and basically everyone else. When pressed to choose 2 evils, I'd choose neither," Sarnatian said with a firm voice. "Let's just forget you joined the orcs after you were banished for noticing the malice of the Imperium," Darius remarked. "I didn't join the orcs. I helped a village rebuild and improved the lives of dozens," Sarnatian snapped back. "Still, the Emani are overly ambitious, greedy and curious, but not out to ritually sacrifice thousands, unlike some other nations." Darius said, "We're almost at Gruntharn," the soldier with the coarse voice said. "Excellent," Darius replied. After the landing in a designated area, Sarnatian looked over at the castle. The walls were manned by human soldiers. Indeed, guards were everywhere. Then there were the beast folk. There were dozens of them. He was escorted to the entrance of a particularly luxurious-looking building. There were dozens of iron boxes mounted on wheels lined up around the building, and human personnel were all around the place. Some were hitting the iron boxes with steel tools. Strange iron contraptions were cleaning the place up. In front of the building were 2 guards. These ones, however, wore lighter armor. There were barrels, full of something all around the place. Each one had a little image of a flame drawn on them. If Sarnatian could pause time, he would have been there for hours, if not days, trying to figure out everything. Sadly, he couldn't. "Word of warning before we enter, you're supposed to sign quite a few things I can Darius said to Sarnatian. "Sure, give me a quill and the papers," Sarnatian said. Darius looked at the elf in surprise. "I said I'd uphold my end of the bargain, and my honor is one of the few things I have left." "Very well. Still, I advise you to read them," Darius said. "I will," Sarnatian simply responded. The first of the papers was an agreement to not disclose his reason for being here, that was to eventually overthrow the Imperium to any non-human personnel at a non-designated meeting spot. The second was a list of several rules, punishments, and guidelines. All of them seemed quite reasonable to Sarnatian. After reading through them, he signed both of them. "That should do it," he said after he had signed the papers. "That does do it," Darius responded, and handed Sarnatian a pair of keys. If anyone not authorized to know the truth asks who you are and what you're doing here, tell them you're a hired servant called Kuranon, known for your excellent dictionaries. Strange story, but I understand it. It's a good explanation as to why I can read, Narration said as he took the keys. I assume these are for my room? He asked. Yes, due to an unforeseen diplomatic encounter, the lieutenant who was supposed to take you to your room has been delayed, Darius said. I suppose I'll just have to wait then, Narration said. A massive, hulking mass of fur, muscle, and horns approached the gates of the castle of Grunthorn. Behind them there were all kinds of fantastical creatures. Tracurius had informed the human diplomats of the beast folk, and although they were reasonably prepared, it was still awe-inspiring to see it in the flesh. Most of the beast folk looked exhausted, or at the very least, downtrodden. Maybe it was because of the rainy weather and gray sky, or perhaps it was because of the intimidating and utilitarian soldiers that manned the walls of the castle they were approaching. Who truly knew? They're a day too late, Tracurius commented. Why are they traveling together? Romano asked. Because they want to ask you something together, Tracurius answered. What's that supposed to mean? Patricia approached and asked Tracurius. The Khat were enslaved and conquered by the Imperium. The Arismer have been raiding the Imperium, and the Surai probably just want to prevent a potential invasion, Tracurius responded. Why not just band together and attack the Imperium? Pretty sure that would annihilate it considering the condition of it, Romano said. They have been a part of the Imperium for thousands of years now. They rely on Imperial sorcerers to maintain their once lush and now depleted fields. Tracurius explained, the Arismer are divided into nomadic and coastal Arismer, and only the latter raids the Imperium as they don't share a direct border. What about the lizards, the Surai? Romano asked. The Surai. Their jungle homeland is infested with demons. They're mostly neutral and aloof, so they probably just want a truce, Tracurius said. Sir, they're asking permission to enter, a soldier said to Romano. Thank God we already know their language, and they aren't entering with an army accompanying them. Romano said, Say they're welcome to enter with a small escort. Yes, sir, the soldier said, as he pressed a button on his helmet. Anything else you decided to not tell us? Patricia asked Tracurius. No, just know that they're most likely after the dissolution of the Imperium, Tracurius responded. Then let's greet our guests, Romano said as he signed 4 soldiers to escort them downstairs. As they walked down the stairs, rain slowly started pouring down from the sky. Amongst the soldiers, there was an aura of anxiety and depression. The same was true for the beast folk, for when Tracurius and the humans accompanying him spotted the beasts, there was a sense of downtroddenness dripping from them. Although Tracurius wasn't an expert when it came to reading the faces of beast folk, he could make out that these people were incredibly nervous. He would be as well, the towering walls, the massive masses of iron guarding the walls, and the gray weather made for an intimidating combination. I am Diplomat Sardinjan of the Khat people, and the leading representative of the Parazet, the League of Free People. One of the felines said to say that Khat resembled humans and elves would be a downright lie. They more so resembled beasts, not people, and if one were not told they were sapient, people would no doubt mistake them for exotic beasts. Despite this fact, before the invasion of Ryman, the Khat had built quite an impressive civilization. The Khat constructed pyramids of the various kinds of stones they could find, and upon these pyramids offered up animals, grain, and jewelry in exchange for magical swords, shields, the bestowment of arcane powers upon certain individuals, and prosperity. That last fact was what drove Ryman, conqueror and uniter of the elves, to try and occupy the Khat homeland, Trevar. It was during this time that Ryman ascended to godhood and fought the Khat gods. 3 years later, and the Khat gods lay dead. With the Khat gods dead or banished, Trevar went from a lush and fertile land to one only held intact by the Imperial College of Ratazat, one of the magical colleges of the Imperium, which, like many others, is also currently allied with Neastos. Salutations, Sir Sardinjan. I am pleased to make your acquaintance. I'm Ambassador Patricia Williams, Patricia said as she bowed, as was tradition for the Khat. From behind the cot diplomat came a hulking frame of pure muscle and fur, a arismer, if Tricurius had to guess. Indeed, the smell alone was enough to confirm his suspicions. The giant smelled like sea salt, rotten fish, and urine. Most likely a coastal arismer, the nomadic variant usually didn't involve themselves in the affairs of other nations. The coastal arismer, however, were ferocious warriors and pirates. They pillaged the shores of the Imperium for slaves, which they then sold back to the Imperium for a lower price. "I am Uyanum," the giant said with a deep, bellowing voice. "Pleased to meet you, Uyanum," Patricia said as he inspected the large man. Without anyone realizing it, the Surai ambassador had somehow maybe their way to the front. Judging by the softer facial features and only 2 eyes instead of 4, it was most likely a female. "Greetings, Ambassador. I'm Yorenzia, emissary of the Buljek, Fulhijek, and Kenhern," she said as she made a low bow. Patricia returned the gesture. "Greetings to you as well, emissary Yorenzia," she said. "Now that we've properly made ourselves acquaintance, I assume the reason you've come here is to attend the negotiations for a peace between the various nations of Narravor and the Imperium, as well as a potential truce and trade agreement between the nations of Narravor and the ULE," she said. The Cot ambassador nodded. "That is why most of us are here. Are we hereby officially invited to these negotiations?" he asked. "You are. However, you are on our land, and your actions are from now on ours to judge," Patricia said, as he made Carlson give her sheets of paper with the agreements everyone had signed earlier on them. "These are contracts detailing the various laws, punishments, and customs you must follow while staying in Grundtharn. You may, of course, choose to reside elsewhere." Patricia said, "Please read through this thoroughly and sign it whenever you are ready." The diplomats nodded, and Patricia handed them the papers and pens. The contracts had been translated into each diplomat's native language so they could read it. Or at least, that was the idea. The Arismer diplomat was apparently illiterate, to the dismay of Patricia, who had Carlson read it out loud to make the situation even worse. The fool decided to not sign the contract and chose to reside outside of the city. Afterwards, various human personnel escorted the diplomats to their chambers. Tricurius, in the meantime, went to his own room. There he got one of his guards to get him a cup of tea and started reading up on Neastos and reports from the capital city. The potential usurper had also arrived, and after finishing his reading session, Tricurius went to visit the man. He had never met Sarnation, only heard of him. According to his family, he was a hot-headed fool. For some reason, however, Tricurius doubted that. He walked through the hallways alone for a change. Sure, the risk of being murdered was higher, but he couldn't risk anyone, even his bodyguards, finding out about Sarnation's plans. Tricurius stood outside the door and knocked. This was to be an interesting conversation. "Come in," a voice inside said. Tricurius did as asked and entered the room. It was an empty room. Maybe it was due to Sarnation just recently arriving, or perhaps it was due to the humans cutting costs, although with their wealth, the latter was unlikely. The walls were a hue of white, with 2 massive windows looking out on the courtyard. There were 3 plants in the room, and the floor was made of dark brown wooden planks. The architectural style looked surreal, fantastical, and foreign, and it was. Interestingly enough, despite the cold weather outside, the rooms within the human embassy were warm and comfortable. Tricurius suspected that another one of their contraptions was at work. In the middle of the room sat Sarnation, a book in his left hand and a cup of a warm, brown substance in his right. The man looked to be around 80 or 30 by the standards of most races. He had blonde hair that reached to his shoulders and bright purple eyes. Unlike most elves, he had a pale complexion. The latter was most likely due to his time spent in Valand, where the sun did not shine as brightly. This was contrasted by Tricurius's tanned skin, darker eyes, and rare brown hair. To Tricurius's surprise, Sarnation was both taller and larger than him, making him an intimidating figure. "I presume you're Tricurius?" Sarnation asked, as he put his book on the table in front of him. "That would be correct," Tricurius responded. "Excellent," Sarnation said. He smiled as he stood up and made a low bow. Trachurius returned the gesture and sat down, as did Sarnation. So, will you aid in usurping the throne from the false ruler Neastos? Trachurius asked. I will, although I have a few questions about the political situation, Sarnation said as he took another sip of the brown beverage. Go ahead, Trachurius said. Sarnation nodded. First of all, Neastos, he controls the colleges of magic, if I'm correct? He asked. Yes, Neastos isn't particularly strong or gifted in magic, but he is great at utilizing opportunities and thrives in chaos. He's persuasive enough to get most of the sorcerers on his side. That should tell you enough. Trachurius responded. So, hypothetically, if that would be removed from him, what would he have left? Sarnation asked. A legion of loyal lords, governors, and soldiers. Trachurius responded. Have you ever met him? He asked. Unfortunately, yes, Sarnation responded. Unfortunately? Trachurius looked at the man quizzically. He's the reason I decided that imperial politics weren't for me. Around 40 years ago, when I was young and naive, I genuinely believed the Imperium maintained order and stability. It sacrificed unnecessary freedoms for the good of thousands, Sarnation said. That changed when one day I was tasked with visiting the despot's estate. I talked with him a bit, and that's when the seeds of doubt began to appear in my head. Sarnation explained. What is that supposed to mean? Trachurius asked. He treated his underlings like pawns. He believed that the greatest would eventually win, that the most intelligent and the most capable would eventually triumph, that the stability we were currently experiencing was soon to be overthrown as the more competent started to demand power and influence, Sarnation said. I can't say I disagree with him. Look at the Imperium now, Sarnation said, before Trachurius could retort. However, he continued. And yet I doubt he truly realized the importance of what he told me. He forgot that his ideal civilization was one that could collapse in on itself at any moment, Sarnation said. So why didn't you do anything before? Trachurius asked the other elf. You didn't let me finish, Sarnation responded. After I returned back to Reimstadt after that conversation, I started to pick up on the incompetence that plagued the management and governing of the capital. You were one of the princes of the Imperium. You could have done something. You could have acted against the incompetence and the instability the Imperium faced and was about to face. Trachurius said. He took a deep breath in and recomposed himself. My apologies. I shouldn't. Before the younger man could finish his sentence, Sarnation interrupted him. Why do you think I went to the cursed province that is Valand? He asked Trachurius. Anyways, after I noticed that I petitioned my father to act, to reform the governing of the Imperium and start an anti-corruption campaign, I however forgot that he got his power due to those incompetent and corrupt governors, dukes, and despots, he explained. And so you were exiled, Trachurius concluded. No, I was ordered to be killed. Sarnation corrected him. It's one of those few moments I'll never forget. It was midnight. I was about to go to bed after finishing Fafnir's dwarven pantheons and gods, he said. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside of my room and the clanking of armor, swords, shields, and spears. That's when I knew it was time to leave. I suspected something like that might happen. I simply didn't expect it to happen so soon. Sarnation said. I opened the window and used a spell I had prepared for that very occasion to slow my fall. I left that cursed estate with 300 Renari, my Valtorn kin, and the clothes on my back. A few seconds later, and the damned soldiers entered. I still vividly remember it, the sound of arrows landing hairs away from me, of soldiers running after me and myself panting and trying to cast spells which tore apart the soldiers, the sickening sound of people being boiled alive within their armor, and the relief I felt when I managed to steal a horse and flee away successfully, Sarnation said as his expression turned from stern to sour, sad even. So why flee to Valand? Trachurius asked with a hint of sympathy in his voice. Why not organize a resistance group or enact vengeance? Trachurius asked. Vengeance wouldn't do anyone any good, Sarnation retorted. If I decided to overthrow the imperial government without the aid of a larger, powerful force, even if I was successful, the Imperium would collapse into chaos, Sarnation said. I understand what Neastos is trying to do. He's trying to establish a meritocracy. And yet he forgets that a nation as large and as rooted in tradition as the Imperium cannot be changed without great effort and time. The former, although certainly a challenge for him, is something he can most likely overcome. The latter, however. Sarnation took a deep breath in. If Neastos wins, which is quite probable, there will be dozens of lords and governors vying for power in Neastos's newly established dominion, probably even against his new system. His system would require time and the blood, sweat, and tears of thousands to flourish, time which isn't available. Before Neastos can truly establish his new imperium, it will be overthrown by a dozen warlords, Sarnation said as he exhaled. Who is to say the same won't happen if I try to usurp the throne? Who says any lord will obey me? Sarnation asked Tracurius. That's what I'm curious about. I don't think you've noticed. Tracurius remarked, Have you seen what the humans are capable of? If you'd take charge with human support, you'd have a whole race with the power of a new form of magic backing you, he said. Have you seen their soldiers, all clad in magically enhanced full-plate armor? Tracurius asked Sarnation. Normally that would be a financial and logistical nightmare, and yet they handle it with apparent ease. These people aren't just brutes who happen to have invented a new form of magic. They possess their own civilization. One so radically different due to this strange new form of magicless magic. It's intimidating enough not just militarily, but also economically to make sure the lords of the Imperium submit permanently, Tracurius explained. That's why I think that if you decide to usurp the throne, it will be different. A cold breeze swept through the air and the trees as Patricia looked out of her office's window and into the castle's courtyard. Former courtyard would be a more fitting description. It had been turned into a part garage and part supply depot. Dozens of vehicles and makeshift tents lined the place. She felt bad for the poor logistics officer tasked with supplying the outpost. Dozens of new species, every single one of them needing different bedrooms, some needing different food, and even some requiring a special narcotic to stay alive. It was a nightmare to supply the place truly. And yet every single day a convoy of supply vehicles, escorted by APCs and armored drones, went through the portal and ensured none would lack anything. Most of the ambassadors of the other species would call it mundane and to be expected, but to her, more so than the guns, soldiers, and vehicles, it displayed power. See, most of the nations of this continent weren't aware that they weren't just supplying hundreds of human personnel and dozens of foreign ambassadors. They were also supplying advanced components, hyperfuel, food, and tools for maintenance. The cherry on top was that the nearest supply depot was located on the moon, hundreds of thousands of miles away. The nations of Naravor were privy to witness only a fraction of the ULE's power. They saw humanity at only its worst. She turned around to face her desk. The nations of Naravor saw a weak humanity. One that was being hamstrung by politics and logistics, however. Should they attack now, they would be decimated. The Earthbound Party might be isolationist, but they're also fiercely nationalistic. The problem was that the second would only be a benefit if they were attacked first. Then there was the FHC. It was a coalition of post-neoliberal moderates, neo-greens, and all sorts of other centrists and moderates. The FHC was mostly in favor of the Naravor expedition, but they were reluctant to send any military hardware her way and were keen on peaceful exploration, no matter how imminent a threat looked. The last major political force was the left. The left was a ragtag group of everything from neo-democratic socialists to full-on revised Marxist-Leninists. They were mostly neutral on the Naravor question and abstained from voting most of the time, perhaps trying to avoid alienating some of their voters. She looked at the pile of documents on her desk and let out a sigh. She had looked out of her window enough. Back to work. Most of the documents were relatively unimportant. They had already been sorted by one of her aides, and the truly important ones had been taken to her directly. What was left was a pile of complaints, requests, and pleas. She took one document from the pile, a complaint from one of the Orcish ambassadors. She tossed it away. Underneath the Orcish complaint there was a veritable mountain of books. The first book had a note attached to it. Comprehensive Guide to Naravor, Tracurius, it read. How hadn't this been taken to her earlier? She removed the note and took in the old dusty book. It had a brown leather cover with beautifully engraved letters on the front and back of it. Time had cast a shallow layer of dust upon it. It looked like something you'd find in a hollow film about Earth's Middle Ages. Judging from the title and the first page, she deduced it was an imperial introduction to theology. Although interesting, she didn't have time to read it. She did, however, assign an administrative officer to digitize the tome and write a shorter report about. She took a look at the other books. One was about philosophy, yet another was on statecraft. She quickly skimmed through books when an interesting name appeared in the one on statecraft. Niastos. Of course, Niastos wasn't an all that uncommon name in the Imperium. However, the longer she kept reading, the more she recognized the similarities. The way Niastos's career was described was identical to how Tracurius described it. For a long time she had tried to garner information on him, bribe his personal guard, send in spies, use drones to monitor the area, and yet very little was revealed about him. His personal guard seemed to view him as a god. Spies weren't able to get close, and drones and bugs were usually destroyed by magical means. She was doubtful Niastos knew what a bug was, but he was somewhat paranoid and would order everyone close to him to magically and thoroughly cleanse themselves and any objects close to them. Besides, the lack of proper logistics ruled out using truly high-tech stuff. She continued reading. The book spoke about his legendary ascension to being Archmagister of the Imperium, how he was a shining example of purity and zeal, and how all other magisters should aspire to be like him. There was not a word about his ambition, in fact. He was even described as humble and easily content. Beyond that, however, another notable thing caught her eye. He was an exceptional artificer. Not a sorcerer or magician. No, he had no real magical talent. Instead, he was an artificer gifted in what the book called expanse temporal magics, using purified ternitia and somehow writing it into steel using dwarven techniques. Apparently, he was so talented that he could tear the fabric of Naravor itself. The implications were massive. An artificer which possessed such talent that he could create tears in reality, much like the portal, she realized. That could prove to be a challenge, she thought as she closed the book. She quickly began writing an L-mail to the administrative division to digitize the document, in order to preserve it and ensure it would be read by any and all important people. Niastos, Reimstadt, the jewel of the Imperium, the beating heart of Ryman's empire, the seat of emperors, it was his. Its towering walls, now his. The palace where the Imperial had resided for thousands of years was now also his. There had been many civil wars, usurpation attempts and uprisings in the history of the Imperium, and yet none of them had seen someone who was not in some way, shape, or form a descendant of Ryman on the throne. "The carriage is ready, my liege," one of his knights said as he made a respectful bow. "Good," Niastos replied. He turned to see his foremost marshal. "How's the army doing?" he asked. "The First Corps sustained heavy casualties due to the sorcerers having issues along that side of the wall. Both the Second and Third Corps are almost at full strength, my liege," he replied. Niastos stepped in the carriage. He gestured to both the marshal and knight to follow. The carriage itself was a work of art. Its inside was gilded with gold and decorated lavishly. It was, however, also practical. Magical runes protected the construct from magical and physical attacks. To attack it, you'd need dozens of well-trained sorcerers combined with at least a score of knights. He looked out of the carriage windows. The sorcerers had made breaches in the wall at several points in the wall. Bricks and stone littered the streets. There was a feeling of sadness. Mothers were weeping in front of the corpses of their children, and children were screaming for their parents, the usual post-siege events. Not that the frequency of it made it any better. He thought of it as a necessary evil. If the people that perished had not died, then they might have produced goods, joined his army, or been a general boon to the nation. If possible, he always avoided bloodshed. Violence kills, burns, and destroys that which he could potentially use. Besides, his army killing and destroying people and things tended to make people rebellious and unhappy with his rule. The outskirts of the city were by far the poorest. Houses were made out of unenchanted concrete. Occasionally the work of magical artists could be seen. Their frescoes decorated the otherwise sad buildings. Shady stores and bars, made out of rotting wood and qualitatively bad clay, lined the streets and produced a sort of atmosphere that no other city could mimic. It was an atmosphere of hope, and yet also one of poverty and disorder. They traveled further into the city, into the older districts. You could see exactly when certain houses were built if you looked closely. The houses here were made of mud brick and concrete. Some had only 2 stories, while others could have up to 5. Arches that were only used in the Zadian period. This was clearly the Zayerte district, infamous for its large markets. Indeed, a bit later, the street led to a large square. In the middle of the square there was a statue of Zadius, sword in hand. Eventually they neared the old city, the city Ryman built and lived in. Dozens of statues of the elven hero dotted the road. The houses here were constructed of magically enhanced marble and richly decorated with flower motifs. Pots with ever-blooming flowers adorned the gravel pathways to the houses. These were the residences of the Imperium's wealthy and powerful. He could see Ryman's temple from here, a testament to the Imperium's power. It was the largest temple constructed in all of Naravor. He visited it a few times as a child. A loud chanting could be heard. It did not sound favorable to him, as was to be expected. He was the antithesis of what the imperial cult desired. He was not of royal blood, nor was he blessed by the cult's patriarch. If there was one group he expected to hate him, it would be the cult. He wasn't worried for now, though. His most trusted marshal had secured the streets beforehand, enforcing a strict code of military law. Although he did mentally note that he should deal with them sometime, lest it be too late to do so. Eventually they reached the palace. It was magnificent. The garden in front of the palace was beautiful. Richly decorated fountains spewed water. Magnificent flowers from all around Naravor adorned the place, and statues of emperors of yore lined the pathways. The carriage halted. He stood up and exited the construct, breathing in the fresh air, the air of the Imperium's jewel, the air of his conquest, his achievement. A soldier near the door made a respectful bow and opened it as he neared. He stepped inside. He was greeted by a gigantic hall. Portraits of all the former emperors adorned the wall. Pots with flowers and various sorts of small trees were placed in between the portraits. The floor was made of marble tiles. At the beginning and the end of the hallway, magnificent marble pillars held up the roof. The pillars were wonderfully decorated, engraved with various flower motifs and made by expert craftsmen. As he progressed through the palace, its splendor did not lessen. Instead, it became all the more magnificent. Structures were held up using magic, carpets made out of the wool of the fantastical Gilphia, furniture made out of leather from wyverns and gilded with silver and gold. Truly it was an example of extravagance beyond compare, and it was his. He looked upon the throne of the Imperium, now his. There was no phony ruler for him to bow to, no corrupt and incompetent fool there for him to praise. Instead, it was empty. My liege. He turned around to find one of his more talented scholars bowing. He looked upon the scholar's face. It was a bronze hue. His eyes, however, were a bright purple, conflicting with his pitch-black hair. His eyebrows were particularly pronounced, and his cheekbones particularly high. He nodded. Yes, speak, he muttered. My liege, I am joyful to tell you that the Torn's eye has been moved into one of the imperial libraries. The scholar said, We have sent 50 guards to ensure it is secure. The scholar added. Again, Nyastos nodded. He gestured to the scholar to follow. Then, let us go to said library at once.